the smell hit you first. Not the dampness of stone walls or the metallic tang of iron bars, but something far worse. A mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair so thick you could taste it on your tongue. This was Victorian Britain's answer to crime, and what happened inside these walls would break most people within weeks. Picture this. You've stolen a loaf of bread because your children are starving. The magistrate gives you 6 months. You think you understand what that means. You don't. Not even remotely. Victorian prisons weren't designed to rehabilitate. They were built to destroy the human spirit so thoroughly that you'd never dare step out of line again. And the methods they used? They were calculated, systematic, and far more psychologically devastating than any medieval torture device. Here's what actually happened behind those iron doors. When you first arrived at a Victorian prison, you were stripped naked in front of guards who treated you like livestock. Every inch of your body was inspected, not for weapons, but for identifying marks. They catalogued scars, birthmarks, tattoos, anything that made you individual. Then they shaved your head completely. Men and women alike, bald as eggs. The uniform came next. Coarse fabric that felt like sandpaper against your skin, deliberately designed to cause constant irritation. The fabric was rough enough to cause rashes after a few days of wear. But that discomfort was intentional, part of a philosophy that punishment should be felt every waking moment. Your name disappeared the instant you put on that uniform. From that point forward, you were a number. Guards would shout that number when they wanted you. Other prisoners would know you only by that number. The prison records listed you as that number. Your identity, everything that made you who you were, got stripped away as efficiently as your clothes had been. Then came the rules. Hundreds of them. The rule book in Pentonville prison ran to over 200 pages. You couldn't speak without permission. You couldn't make eye contact with other prisoners. You couldn't walk at your own pace during exercise. Everyone moved in lockstep. Breaking any of these rules meant punishment, and Victorian prisons had perfected the art of making punishment unbearable. The silence rule might sound simple until you realize what it actually meant. Imagine going months, sometimes years, without having a conversation with another human being. Guards could speak to you, but you couldn't respond except to say, "Yes, sir," or "No, sir." Other prisoners walked past you every day, and you couldn't acknowledge their existence. People went insane from the silence. Not figuratively, literally insane. Prison records from the 1840s show that mental breakdowns were so common they stopped recording them all. Men would start talking to themselves, creating elaborate conversations with imaginary people. Some prisoners would deliberately break rules just to hear a guard yell at them, because any human voice was better than the endless, crushing silence. Your cell was your entire world. 6 feet wide, 9 feet long, 10 feet high. A plank bed with no mattress. A bucket for waste that you'd empty once per day. A tiny window placed so high you couldn't see out of it. Just a rectangle of sky that told you whether it was day or night. That was it. That was your universe. In that cell, you'd spend between 18 and 23 hours every single day. The Victorian prison reformers believed this isolation would force you to reflect on your crimes and become a better person. What actually happened was that prisoners' minds started deteriorating within weeks. The work was designed to be pointless. That's not an exaggeration. The pointlessness was the entire purpose. Prison officials believed that hard labor should serve no productive function, because if the work was useful, prisoners might take pride in it. Can't have that. The treadwheel was Victorian ingenuity at its cruelest. Imagine a massive paddle wheel, 20 feet in diameter, divided into sections like a water wheel. Prisoners would step into these sections and climb continuously for hours. The wheel was connected to nothing. It ground no grain. It pumped no water. It accomplished absolutely nothing, except exhausting the prisoners who climbed it. You'd climb the equivalent of 7,000 to 14,000 feet per day on the treadwheel. That's climbing halfway up Mount Everest every single day going nowhere. Your legs would scream, your lungs would burn. The monotonous step, step, step would invade your dreams on the rare occasions you managed to sleep. The crank was even worse in its psychological impact. You'd sit in your cell with a machine that had a handle connected to a counting mechanism. Your daily requirement might be 10,000 turns. The handle was connected to nothing but paddles moving through sand, creating resistance. You'd crank that handle 10,000 times, watching the counter slowly increment, knowing that every rotation accomplished precisely nothing. Some prisoners would crank for 8, 10, 12 hours straight, trying to meet their quota. If you failed to reach your number, you didn't eat dinner. Simple as that. The guards could also adjust the resistance by tightening screws, making the crank harder to turn. Some guards would do this maliciously, watching prisoners struggle to meet quotas that had suddenly become impossible. Oakum picking destroyed your hands. Prisoners would receive bundles of old rope, tarred and hardened from years at sea. Your job was to untwist these ropes, separate every single fibre, until you had a pile of loose material that could be used for caulking ships. The tarred fibres would slice your fingers open. The constant twisting motion would make your hands cramp and swell. After weeks of oakum picking, some prisoners' hands were so damaged they could barely hold a spoon. The diet was calculated to keep you alive and nothing more. Breakfast was gruel, a watery porridge made from oatmeal that tasted like paste mixed with water. Lunch might be a small piece of bread and a potato. Dinner was more bread, sometimes with a tiny portion of meat on Sundays. The calorie count was just enough to prevent starvation while ensuring constant hunger. Prisoners lost dramatic amounts of weight. A healthy man entering prison at 170 pounds might weigh 130 pounds after 6 months. The constant hunger gnawed at you, made it difficult to think about anything else. Guards knew this. They'd eat their meals within sight of prisoners sometimes, just to remind you of what real food looked like. Water was rationed too. You received 3 pints per day for all purposes: drinking, washing, cleaning your cell. 3 pints, less than 2 litres. In summer, prisoners would become so desperate for water, they'd drink from the bucket they used as a toilet, after it had been emptied and rinsed. The separate system was Victorian Britain's proudest prison innovation and its most psychologically destructive. Under this system, prisoners had zero contact with each other. Not in cells, not during work, not during chapel, nowhere. When you left your cell for any reason, you wore a hood that covered your entire face, except for small eye holes. You couldn't see who was around you. They couldn't see you. You were a ghost moving through a building full of other ghosts. Chapel was mandatory, but you sat in individual wooden stalls with high sides so you couldn't see the prisoner next to you. You faced forward, staring at the chaplain, surrounded by dozens of other prisoners you couldn't see or speak to. The chaplain would drone on about sin and redemption while you sat there, alone in a room full of people, which somehow felt worse than being alone in your cell. Exercise happened in separate yards, each prisoner walking in a circle within their designated section, unable to communicate with anyone else. You'd hear footsteps, coughs, the shuffle of feet on stone, but you couldn't connect those sounds to actual human beings. The sensory deprivation was absolute and intentional. Prisoners started hallucinating within months. They'd see people who weren't there, hear voices calling their names, feel presences in their cells at night. The prison chaplains attributed this to guilty consciences being awakened. Medical officers knew it was mental breakdown caused by isolation, but the system continued anyway. Medical care in Victorian prisons was a joke, except nobody was laughing. The prison doctor might visit once per week if you were lucky. Most ailments were dismissed as malingering. Prisoners trying to get out of work. Actually sick. Prove it. And the bar for proof was absurdly high. Tuberculosis spread through prisons like wildfire. The combination of poor nutrition, damp conditions, and weakened immune systems created perfect conditions for the disease. Prisoners would cough blood into their hands, develop fevers that left them shaking on their plank beds, and receive no treatment beyond being moved to a slightly less crowded cell. Cholera outbreaks killed dozens at a time. When disease struck, prison officials' primary concern was preventing it from spreading to the staff, not treating the prisoners who had it. Sick prisoners were sometimes left in their cells for days without any medical attention, just checked periodically to see if they were still alive. Dental problems were solved with pliers and no anesthetic. Infected tooth? The doctor would yank it out while you were held down by guards. No numbing, no pain relief afterward. Just back to your cell to deal with the bleeding mouth on your own. The punishment cells made your regular cell look like luxury accommodation. These were underground spaces, smaller than standard cells, with no window at all. Complete darkness, except when guards opened the food slot twice per day. You'd lose track of time almost immediately. Was it day or night? How many days had you been there? The darkness played tricks on your mind. You'd spend 24 hours per day in that darkness for infractions as minor as speaking during work or failing to meet your crank quota. Some prisoners did weeks in the punishment cells. When they emerged, they'd stumble in normal daylight, their eyes unable to adjust. Some never fully recovered their vision. The punishment diet made the regular prison food seem like a feast. Bread and water, that's it. Not even gruel. Just hard bread and water, for however many days your punishment lasted. Prisoners would lose even more weight, become weak and dizzy, but that was considered appropriate for someone who had broken the rules. Flogging was reserved for serious infractions, but the definition of serious was flexible. Striking a guard, obviously flogging. Repeated violations of silence could be flogging. The cat o' nine tails had 9 separate cords, each designed to break skin. Prisoners would be tied to a wooden frame and whipped while other inmates were forced to watch as a deterrent. The psychological impact of watching a flogging was sometimes worse than receiving one. You'd hear the whistle of the cords through air, the crack as they hit flesh, the screams that even the toughest men couldn't suppress. Then you'd go back to your cell and know that any significant rule violation could put you in that same position. Women's prisons operated under the same basic principles, but with additional humiliations specific to gender. Women prisoners had their hair shorn even shorter than men's, leaving them nearly bald. The prison uniform was deliberately unflattering and uncomfortable, designed to remove any trace of femininity. Pregnant women received no special treatment. They'd work the crank, or pick oakum until they went into labour, then give birth in their cell with minimal medical assistance. The baby would be taken away within days, sent to a workhouse or orphanage. Some women never learned what happened to their children. The matrons who supervised women's prisons were often harsher than male guards in men's prisons. They viewed their role as correcting moral deficiency, and their methods for correction involved constant humiliation and degradation. Women who cried were punished for weakness. Women who showed anger were punished for improper emotion. There was no acceptable way to behave except in complete, silent submission. Children as young as 8 years old were sent to these prisons. Let that sink in for a moment. An 8-year-old child, possibly imprisoned for stealing food, subjected to the same isolation, silence, and pointless labour as adult criminals. The psychological damage was catastrophic and permanent. Juvenile prisoners were supposedly kept separate from adults, but in practice, they experienced the same conditions. Same silence rules, same isolation, same terrible food. The only concession was slightly shorter work hours, but that meant more time alone in their cells, which might actually have been worse. Many children emerged from Victorian prisons fundamentally broken. They'd learned nothing except how to endure suffering. The recidivism rate for juvenile offenders was staggering because prison had taught them they were worthless criminals rather than children who'd made mistakes. The system created exactly what it claimed to prevent. The long-term effects of Victorian imprisonment destroyed lives even after release. Prisoners who'd spent years in silence often couldn't reintegrate into normal society. They'd struggle with basic conversations, feel overwhelmed in crowds, panic in social situations. Their minds had adapted to isolation so completely that freedom felt like torture. Employment was nearly impossible for ex-convicts. Victorian society believed that criminal tendencies were permanent character flaws. Why would anyone hire someone who'd been in prison when there were plenty of people who hadn't? Former prisoners often ended up homeless or returned to crime out of sheer desperation, fulfilling the prophecy that they were irredeemable criminals. Families frequently disowned prisoners after their release. The shame of having a family member in prison was so intense that many families would rather pretend that person had died. Former prisoners would return home to find their belongings gone, their room rented to someone else, and their relatives refusing to acknowledge them. The Victorian prison system was designed by people who genuinely believed they were being humanitarian. They'd looked at the filthy, chaotic prisons of earlier eras and decided that order, cleanliness, and isolation would reform criminals into honest citizens. What they actually created was a machine for destroying human psychology with industrial efficiency. These reformers wrote extensively about their philosophies, published books detailing how their systems would transform criminals into productive members of society. They measured success by whether prisoners followed rules and completed their pointless tasks, completely ignoring the mental deterioration happening right in front of them. The tragic irony is that they succeeded in creating exactly what they thought they were preventing. By treating prisoners as less than human, they made rehabilitation impossible. The system broke people so thoroughly that they had no choice but to return to crime after release, which the reformers then used as evidence that criminals were inherently immoral, rather than acknowledging that their system had created the problem. But we haven't even touched on the worst aspects yet. The medical experiments, the exploitation of prison labour for profit, the deliberate psychological torture disguised as discipline. These darker elements reveal just how sophisticated Victorian cruelty could become when wrapped in the language of reform and righteousness. The medical care in Victorian prisons wasn't healthcare. It was a continuation of punishment by other means. Prison doctors were typically the least qualified physicians available, men who'd failed in private practice or who viewed the position as easy money for minimal work. They examined hundreds of prisoners in assembly line fashion, spending perhaps 30 seconds per patient, if that. Most examinations consisted of asking if the prisoner felt ill, and if the prisoner said yes, the standard response was that they were malingering to avoid work. Actual medical treatment was deliberately minimal. The prevailing belief was that prisoners would fake illness to escape labour, so doctors were instructed to assume every complaint was fraudulent unless proven otherwise. This meant that genuine illnesses went untreated until they became visible, by which point they were often fatal. Tuberculosis spread through Victorian prisons like wildfire. The combination of poor ventilation, malnutrition, and overcrowding created perfect conditions for the disease. Prisoners would cough blood for months before doctors acknowledged they were genuinely sick. By then, they'd infected dozens of other inmates. The response wasn't to improve conditions or isolate the sick. It was to add tuberculosis to the list of diseases prisoners were suspected of faking. Scurvy was rampant, despite being completely preventable. The prison diet contained virtually no vitamin C, and prisoners who developed the telltale symptoms, bleeding gums, loose teeth, skin lesions, were often accused of self-harm to gain sympathy. Some prison doctors genuinely didn't recognize scurvy because they'd only read about it in medical texts describing sailors on long voyages, not prisoners in modern institutions. Mental illness was treated as moral failure rather than medical condition. Prisoners who developed psychosis from prolonged isolation were viewed as proving that they'd been morally deficient all along. The treatment was more isolation, on the theory that removing them from other prisoners protected those others from moral contamination. Depression was so universal among Victorian prisoners that it wasn't even recognized as a medical condition. Doctors viewed it as the natural state of someone contemplating their crimes. If a prisoner seemed excessively despondent, the solution was to increase their workload so they'd be too exhausted to dwell on negative thoughts. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Some Victorian prisons became sites for medical experimentation on prisoners who had no ability to refuse. These weren't formal research programs with oversight. They were individual doctors using their captive patient population to test theories or practice procedures they couldn't perform on paying patients. Prisoners were ideal subjects because they couldn't complain effectively, had no families who'd advocate for them, and if something went wrong, well, who would care about a criminal? Surgical procedures were practiced on prisoners without anesthesia, partly because anesthesia was expensive, but also because some doctors believed criminals had higher pain tolerance or deserved to suffer. Prisoners would be held down by guards while doctors performed operations, their screams echoing through cell blocks as warnings to others. Experimental treatments for mental illness were particularly horrific. Doctors tried everything from ice water baths to induced fevers to primitive electrical shocks. The goal wasn't to help the prisoner, but to test whether these methods might work on paying patients later. Success was measured by whether the prisoner became more compliant, not whether they actually improved. One common treatment for mental disturbance was the rotational chair. Prisoners were strapped into a chair that was then spun rapidly for extended periods, sometimes until they vomited or lost consciousness. The theory was that spinning would redistribute fluids in the brain and restore mental balance. The reality was that it caused severe disorientation, nausea, and in some cases, permanent neurological damage. Dietary experiments were conducted to determine minimum caloric requirements for human survival. Some prisons systematically reduced food rations to see how little prisoners could eat while still performing labor. When prisoners collapsed or died, that data point was recorded and the rations adjusted slightly upward. The goal was finding the cheapest possible way to keep prisoners alive enough to work. These experiments were documented in medical journals as legitimate research. Doctors published papers about their findings with no sense that using prisoners as unwilling test subjects was ethically questionable. The prevailing view was that criminals had forfeited their right to bodily autonomy when they committed crimes. The exploitation of prison labour reached industrial scales during the Victorian-era, transforming prisons into profit centres disguised as rehabilitation facilities. Prisoners manufactured goods that were sold on the open market at prices that undercut free workers. Prison-made products flooded Victorian markets: furniture, textiles, shoes, rope, literally hundreds of different items. Businesses loved it because the labour costs were essentially zero. Prisoners were paid nothing or perhaps a few pence per week, amounts so small they were insulting. Free workers despised this system because it destroyed their livelihoods. How could an independent craftsman compete with prison workshops that paid no wages, no benefits, had no safety requirements, and could force workers to labour 12 hours daily? Entire industries were disrupted by prison labour, driving down wages and eliminating jobs. But the prison authorities and the businesses that contracted with them made enormous profits. They framed it as teaching prisoners valuable skills and work habits. The reality was that prisoners learned to perform one repetitive task for years, gaining no transferable skills whatsoever. A prisoner who spent 5 years picking oakum or sewing mailbags had learned nothing useful for employment after release. The working conditions in prison workshops made regular factories look humane by comparison. Prisoners worked without safety equipment in environments filled with toxic fumes, dangerous machinery, and hazardous materials. Injuries were constant. Fingers crushed in presses, lungs damaged by chemical exposure, backs destroyed by years of bending over workbenches. Medical treatment for work injuries was minimal because that would reduce productive labour time. Prisoners with broken fingers would have them roughly splintered and be sent back to work the same day. Those who couldn't work due to injury had their already meagre food rations reduced as punishment for unproductiveness. Some prisons operated as essentially private businesses disguised as correctional facilities. Private contractors would pay prisons for access to prisoner labour, then work those prisoners as hard as physically possible to maximise return on investment. These contractors had no incentive to care about prisoner welfare because there was always a fresh supply of convicts. The treadwheel, which we discussed earlier, was also used to generate actual power in some prisons. Prisoners would climb for hours, turning gears that ground grain or pumped water, their labour directly producing value that was sold for profit. They were human engines, literally. This economic exploitation was justified through elaborate moral reasoning. Prison authorities argued that prisoners were repaying their debt to society through labour. The fact that society, or rather private businesses, profited enormously from this labour, while the prisoners received nothing, was considered appropriate. Criminals didn't deserve compensation for work because the work itself was their punishment. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. Prisoners understood they were being exploited but were powerless to resist. Any refusal to work meant solitary confinement, reduced rations, or physical punishment. They watched free workers outside the walls earning wages for similar work while they earned nothing, reinforcing the message that they were subhuman. Some prisoners spent decades in this system, their entire adult lives consumed by forced labour that benefited everyone except themselves. By the time they were released, they were often physically broken, with damaged joints, ruined eyesight, respiratory problems, and chronic pain from years of industrial work without proper safety measures or medical care. The deliberate psychological torture in Victorian prisons extended far beyond simple isolation. Prison authorities developed sophisticated methods for breaking prisoners' spirits while maintaining plausible deniability that they were being cruel. The silent system, which we've touched on, was enforced with psychological precision. Guards were instructed to ignore prisoners completely except when giving orders or administering punishment. No eye contact, no acknowledgement of their humanity, nothing. Prisoners existed in a social void where they were simultaneously under constant surveillance and completely invisible. This treatment was designed to make prisoners question their own existence. After months or years of being treated as if you don't exist, many prisoners internalized that message. They'd stop initiating any form of communication, stop trying to catch guards' attention, essentially collaborating in their own erasure. Letters from family were heavily censored, with anything positive or encouraging removed. Prison authorities believed that maintaining prisoners' connections to their previous lives would interfere with reformation. Letters that made prisoners feel loved or missed were considered harmful because they might make prisoners less desperate to change. The few letters prisoners were allowed to send out were similarly censored. Any complaints about conditions, any expressions of suffering, any requests for help, all deleted. Families received sanitized versions that made prison sound almost pleasant, preventing outside intervention and ensuring prisoners remained isolated. Visiting rights were deliberately structured to maximize psychological pain. Visitors and prisoners were separated by screens or barriers that prevented physical contact. Conversations were monitored and could be terminated instantly if topics strayed into forbidden territory. These visits, meant to maintain family connections, often became exercises in mutual torture, as family members watched their loved ones deteriorate without being able to help. Children were sometimes brought to visit imprisoned parents, but the experience was so traumatic for both parties that many prisoners refused further visits. Imagine seeing your child for 15 minutes every 6 months, separated by glass, unable to hug them, while guards stand ready to end the visit if you say the wrong thing. The psychological damage to both prisoner and child was immense. Some prisons implemented a system where prisoners earned visiting privileges through good behaviour, then had those privileges revoked for minor infractions. This created a cycle of hope and despair that was psychologically devastating. Prisoners would maintain perfect behavior for months to earn a visit, then lose it because they accidentally made eye contact with another prisoner. The unpredictability of punishment was itself a form of psychological torture. Rules were enforced inconsistently, with identical behaviors resulting in different consequences depending on which guard witnessed them or what mood that guard was in. This created an environment of constant anxiety where prisoners could never feel safe even when following rules perfectly. Religious instruction was mandatory but was weaponized to reinforce prisoners' worthlessness. Prison chaplains delivered sermons emphasizing that criminals were moral failures destined for eternal damnation unless they completely transformed themselves. These weren't messages of hope and redemption. They were psychological assaults dressed as spiritual guidance. Prisoners were forced to sit through hours of these sermons in chapel, unable to move or show any reaction. Falling asleep during sermons was punished severely. The content was deliberately designed to induce shame and self-loathing, reinforcing the message that prisoners were fundamentally defective human beings. Reading material, when allowed at all, was restricted to religious texts selected to emphasize sin and punishment. Prisoners couldn't read anything that might provide escape or intellectual stimulation. Even the Bible was provided in editions with notes emphasizing punishment and suffering while downplaying messages of forgiveness or redemption. The classification system in prisons created hierarchies among prisoners that fueled conflict and prevented solidarity. Prisoners were categorized by offense type and given different colored uniforms or badges. This ensured everyone knew what everyone else had done, creating an internal social system where prisoners judged each other. First-time offenders were separated from repeat offenders, but this separation was incomplete enough that the first-timers could see the repeat offenders and understand they were being shown their future. The message was clear. You will be back. This is your destiny. Resistance is futile. Prisoners who showed signs of mental deterioration weren't removed from general population until they became violent or completely non-functional. Other prisoners had to watch their fellow inmates slowly lose their minds, understanding that the same fate likely awaited them. The progression system, where prisoners could theoretically earn better conditions through good behavior, was designed to be almost impossible to achieve. The requirements were so strict and the timeline so long that most prisoners never advanced through the stages. This created learned helplessness. Why bother trying when success is impossible? Guards were trained to view prisoners as fundamentally different from normal humans. New guards received instruction emphasizing that any sympathy toward prisoners was weakness that criminals would exploit. This training created guards who genuinely believed cruelty was necessary and appropriate. The architecture itself was designed for psychological impact. Cells were deliberately sized to be uncomfortable. Too small to move freely, but large enough that prisoners couldn't touch both walls simultaneously. This prevented both exercise and the comfort of physical boundaries. The spaces were designed to be psychologically claustrophobic without being legally definable as such. Windows, when present, were positioned to prevent prisoners from seeing anything meaningful. They might show a small square of sky, but nothing else. No trees, no birds, no signs of life beyond the walls. Some prisons positioned windows to show only other cell blocks, ensuring prisoners saw nothing but more prison wherever they looked. The entire system was calibrated to induce a specific psychological state: complete hopelessness combined with desperate desire to comply. Prisoners needed to believe their situation was permanent and unescapable, while simultaneously believing that perfect obedience might somehow improve things. This contradiction was the point. Human beings need hope to survive psychologically. Victorian prison authorities understood this and weaponized it. They provided just enough hope to keep prisoners functional while ensuring that hope was never fulfilled, creating a sustainable state of psychological torture that could continue for years without killing the prisoner outright. The psychological warfare extended beyond the architecture and routine into every interaction prisoners had with authority. Guards were instructed to enforce rules inconsistently, creating an environment where prisoners could never predict what would trigger punishment. A behavior tolerated one day might result in solitary confinement the next. This randomness was intentional. When humans can't predict consequences, they become hypervigilant and anxious, constantly monitoring their environment for threats. Victorian prison authorities recognized that unpredictable punishment creates more compliant subjects than consistent discipline ever could. The medical treatment available in these institutions reveals how thoroughly authorities had abandoned any pretense of rehabilitation. Prison doctors were explicitly instructed that their primary duty was maintaining order, not healing. Medical complaints were routinely dismissed as malingering unless the prisoner was literally dying. Even obvious illnesses were often left untreated for weeks or months. The message was clear: your suffering doesn't matter, your body doesn't matter, you are nothing. Dental care was essentially non-existent. Prisoners with toothaches might wait months for extraction, the only treatment offered. The extraction would be performed without anesthetic, serving both as medical intervention and punishment. Other prisoners could hear the screams echoing through the halls, adding another layer of ambient terror to daily life. These sounds weren't accidental. Authorities understood the psychological impact of hearing others in extreme pain. The handling of mental health deterioration was particularly cruel. Prisoners showing signs of psychological breakdown were often placed in darker, smaller cells as punishment for their symptoms. The Victorian understanding of mental illness as moral weakness meant that going insane was treated as a character, failing deserving additional punishment rather than a predictable response to torture. When prisoners became completely non-functional, they might be transferred to asylums, but only after deteriorating to the point of permanent damage. Communication with the outside world was controlled to maximize psychological isolation. Letters from family members were heavily censored, with any content deemed too encouraging or comforting simply removed. Prisoners might receive letters with entire paragraphs blacked out, knowing their loved ones had tried to reach them but unable to access those messages. Some prisons had policies of delivering letters weeks or months late, ensuring any time-sensitive information was useless by the time prisoners received it. Outgoing letters faced even stricter censorship. Prisoners couldn't describe conditions truthfully without having their letters confiscated. Any complaint about treatment meant the letter wouldn't be sent, and the prisoner would face punishment for attempted communication of prohibited content. This created an impossible choice: maintain contact with family through lies and omissions, or tell the truth and lose all contact. Most prisoners chose the former, meaning families had no idea what their loved ones endured. Visiting privileges, when granted at all, were structured to maximize pain rather than provide comfort. Visits occurred in rooms divided by barriers that prevented physical contact. Conversations happened under guard supervision with strict time limits, often as short as 15 minutes for visits that family members might have traveled hours to attend. The guards would terminate visits instantly for any rule violation, real or perceived. Prisoners had to watch their families leave, knowing it might be months before they could see them again, if ever. Some prisons implemented systems where prisoners could see visitors but not speak to them, only communicate through written notes passed under guard supervision. This created situations where family members stood feet away but might as well have been miles distant. Children grew up not remembering what their parents' voice sounded like. Spouses became strangers, separated by glass and silence. The economic exploitation within prisons added another dimension of suffering. Prisoners performed labor that generated substantial profits for contractors and prison authorities, but received either no compensation or payment so minimal it was essentially symbolic. The work was deliberately exhausting and often dangerous. Injuries were common, and medical treatment for work-related injuries was no better than for illness. Prisoners who couldn't work due to injury faced punishment for failing to meet quotas. The types of labor assigned were chosen specifically to be soul-crushing rather than skill-building. oakum picking, where prisoners spent hours separating tarred rope fibers with their bare hands, served no rehabilitative purpose. The work destroyed fingernails and caused permanent hand damage while producing a product of minimal value. The point wasn't the output, it was keeping prisoners occupied with meaningless suffering. Treadmills represented peak Victorian ingenuity in pointless torture. Prisoners climbed steps on a rotating wheel for hours, literally going nowhere while expending enormous energy. Some treadmills were connected to grain mills, giving the labour minimal productive purpose. Others simply turned in place, the effort producing nothing except exhaustion. Guards monitored to ensure prisoners maintained pace, punishing any slowing with additional time or reduced rations. The crank was another innovation in meaningless labour. Prisoners turned a handle connected to paddles in a box of sand, the resistance adjustable by guards. They were required to complete thousands of turns before earning meals. Guards would tighten the resistance if prisoners completed turns too quickly, ensuring the work remained maximally difficult regardless of effort expended. This device had no purpose except torture. It produced nothing, taught nothing, accomplished nothing except breaking human spirits. Shot drill involved prisoners repeatedly lifting cannonballs, carrying them to another location, then returning them to the original position, for hours, every day. The complete pointlessness was intentional. Authorities wanted prisoners to understand their labour served no purpose beyond punishment, that their effort and suffering meant nothing, that they were engaged in eternal meaningless repetition. The prison diet was calculated to keep prisoners alive while ensuring constant hunger and malnutrition. Meals consisted primarily of bread, gruel, and occasionally small amounts of meat so poor in quality it was barely edible. The portions were scientifically calibrated to provide just enough calories to prevent starvation while ensuring prisoners remained perpetually hungry. This constant hunger became another form of psychological torture, as prisoners spent hours each day focused on their next inadequate meal. Food quality deteriorated further as punishment for infractions. Prisoners in solitary confinement received even more minimal rations, sometimes nothing but bread and water for weeks. The bread provided to punished prisoners was often deliberately made stale or mouldy. Drinking water might be deliberately warmed to body temperature, making it psychologically harder to consume even when desperately thirsty. The timing of meals was used as another control mechanism. Prisoners might receive their first meal late enough that they'd been awake and working for hours already hungry. The final meal came early enough that they faced a long, hungry evening and night. This scheduling ensured maximum suffering from the inadequate portions provided. Guards monitored eating to ensure prisoners didn't save food for later, forcing them to experience the full psychological impact of knowing the next meal was many hours away. Sanitation in Victorian prisons was deliberately inadequate despite contemporary understanding of hygiene's importance. Cells might have chamber pots that were emptied once daily, meaning prisoners spent 23 hours sharing space with their own waste. The smell was overwhelming, particularly in summer heat. This wasn't ignorance. Authorities understood basic sanitation, but viewed prisoner discomfort as appropriate and deserved. Washing facilities were minimal or non-existent. Prisoners might be allowed to wash once a week, in cold water, with minimal soap, in communal areas that ensured no privacy. Bathing was treated as a privilege that could be revoked for infractions, meaning prisoners might go weeks without washing. The resulting filth and body odour added to the dehumanizing environment, making prisoners physically repulsive to each other and to themselves. Clothing was provided but rarely replaced. Prisoners wore the same garments for months or years, the fabric deteriorating and becoming increasingly uncomfortable and unhygienic. Uniforms were intentionally designed to be humiliating, ill-fitting, marked with obvious prison insignia, and made from the coarsest materials available. The discomfort was constant and inescapable. Bedding consisted of thin mattresses on wooden planks with a single rough blanket regardless of season. Winter brought suffering from cold that prisoners couldn't escape. Summer brought different misery as the unventilated cells became ovens. The bedding was rarely, if ever, washed, accumulating months or years of human oils, sweat, and filth. Prisoners developed skin conditions and infestations that went untreated, adding physical misery to psychological torment. The lighting in cells deserves particular attention as an instrument of control. Natural light was deliberately restricted through small, high windows that prevented prisoners from seeing outside while providing barely enough illumination to prevent complete darkness. Artificial lighting was minimal or non-existent. As daylight faded, prisoners were plunged into near-total darkness for 12 to 14 hours, unable to see their own hands, surrounded by stone walls in complete isolation. This daily descent into darkness became a psychological ordeal that prisoners experienced with mounting dread as afternoon turned to evening. Temperature control was similarly weaponized. Cells were unheated in winter, when prisoners might wake to find frost on the interior walls. The single thin blanket provided no real protection against cold that seeped through stone walls. Prisoners learned to sleep curled in tight balls, trying to preserve body heat, waking repeatedly through the night from cold. Summer brought opposite torture as stone cells absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, preventing sleep through different means. The sensory environment was calibrated for maximum psychological impact. Silence was enforced so strictly that prisoners became hypersensitive to any sound. The footsteps of guards on stone floors became objects of intense focus as prisoners tried to predict whether the steps would stop at their cell. Keys jangling on guard belts created Pavlovian responses as prisoners learned to associate these sounds with cell doors opening and the possibility of punishment. But the silence wasn't complete. Prisoners could hear each other's suffering. Coughs echoing from other cells, screams from those being punished, the sounds of chamber pots being emptied. These ambient reminders of other human presence nearby but unreachable intensified the isolation. You weren't alone, but you might as well be. The knowledge that others suffered within feet of you while you remained powerless to help or even acknowledge them added another dimension of psychological torment. The seasonal rhythms of life outside prison walls became sources of torture rather than comfort. Prisoners might hear birds singing in spring, the sounds filtering through high windows to remind them of a world continuing without them. They experienced seasonal changes only through temperature variations and subtle shifts in the quality of light reaching their cells. Years passed, measured only by these minimal markers, each season identical to the last in its misery. Religious observation was mandatory, but stripped of any genuine spiritual comfort. Chapel services emphasized sin, punishment, and unworthiness. Prisoners sat in individual cubicles that prevented them from seeing anyone except the chaplain, ensuring even this communal activity remained isolating. The sermons were deliberately harsh, focusing on prisoners' moral failings and the justice of their suffering. Any message of redemption was contingent on levels of repentance and transformation that the system itself made impossible to achieve. The cumulative effect of these conditions was a specific form of psychological destruction that Victorian authorities understood and intended. They weren't trying to reform criminals through education or skill building. They were attempting to break human spirits so completely that former prisoners would be too damaged to reoffend, too traumatized to resist authority, too psychologically destroyed to function as anything except compliant subjects of social control. The system succeeded in creating damaged humans. Whether this served any legitimate social purpose is the question that haunts these institutions' legacy. The machinery of Victorian punishment extended beyond physical cells into elaborate systems of observation and documentation that transformed prisoners into permanent case studies. Every aspect of an inmate's existence was recorded, categorized, and analyzed with a thoroughness that would impress modern data scientists. Prison authorities maintained detailed registries tracking everything from physical measurements to behavioral patterns, creating permanent records that followed individuals long after their sentences ended. Photography became a crucial tool in this surveillance apparatus. Within days of arrival, prisoners were photographed from multiple angles, creating visual records that established their criminal identity. These weren't simple identification photos. Victorian prison photography followed strict protocols designed to capture what authorities believed were physiological markers of criminal tendency. Head size, facial asymmetries, ear shapes, all were documented under the pseudo-scientific belief that criminality manifested in measurable physical characteristics. These photographic records weren't kept confidential. Police departments across Britain maintained collections of criminal photographs that officers studied, memorizing faces and supposedly distinctive features. A man released from prison after serving his sentence might walk into a shop in a town he'd never visited before and find himself recognized by a constable who'd memorized his photograph. The surveillance extended far beyond prison walls, creating a permanent mark that no amount of rehabilitation could erase. Bertillon measurements added another layer to this documentation obsession. Prison officials meticulously recorded dozens of body measurements: height, arm span, finger length, foot size, skull dimensions. The theory held that these measurements were unique to individuals and unchangeable, providing absolute identification. Guards spent hours with calipers and measuring tapes, reducing human beings to sets of numbers that supposedly revealed essential truths about criminal nature. Beyond physical documentation, authorities maintained exhaustive behavioral records. Guards filed daily reports, noting every infraction, every sign of resistance or submission, every deviation from expected conduct. These reports accumulated into thick files that prison governors reviewed when making decisions about privileges, punishments, or release. A prisoner's entire sentence became a test, where every moment was graded, every action interpreted as evidence of character. The classification systems that emerged from this data collection were remarkably detailed. Prisoners weren't simply categorized by crime, but by elaborate typologies that supposedly predicted behavior and guided treatment. First offenders were separated from habitual criminals, though the criteria for these designations were often arbitrary. Violent offenders received different treatment than property criminals, based on theories about criminal psychology that had little empirical foundation. But classification extended into stranger territory. Prison authorities developed elaborate schemes for categorizing inmates by supposed moral development. A prisoner might be classified as hardened beyond redemption or showing signs of moral awakening, with these designations affecting everything from work assignments to visitation privileges. The criteria for these judgments were entirely subjective, usually reflecting nothing more than whether a prisoner had learned to perform the submission that authorities demanded. The marking system that governed prisoner status was particularly insidious. Inmates earned marks through good behavior and work performance, with accumulation of sufficient marks determining progression through increasingly less restrictive conditions. On paper, this seemed rational, rewarding improvement with gradually restored privileges. In practice, it was a psychological manipulation tool that made prisoners complicit in their own subjection. The marking system created intense competition and isolation among prisoners who might otherwise have formed bonds of solidarity. Each inmate was focused on accumulating individual marks, making them reluctant to do anything that might jeopardize their progression. This prevented the formation of collective resistance or mutual support networks. Prisoners became focused on gaming the system rather than questioning its legitimacy. Guards wielded enormous discretionary power in awarding or withholding marks. A prisoner's progression depended not on objective criteria, but on whether they'd sufficiently performed the kind of submission that particular guards wanted to see. This gave guards tremendous leverage for demanding specific behaviors, creating a dynamic where prisoners learned to anticipate and fulfill the expectations of those who controlled their fate. The mark system also extended sentences by creating requirements beyond the original judicial sentence. A prisoner sentenced to 5 years might serve 7 or 8 if they didn't accumulate marks at the expected rate. This meant the actual duration of punishment was determined not by courts, but by prison administrators whose judgments were unappealable and often capricious. Labour within these institutions deserves particular attention because it reveals how Victorian authorities conceptualized the purpose of imprisonment. Work wasn't primarily about teaching useful skills or preparing prisoners for employment after release. It was designed as punishment, deliberately structured to be exhausting, mind-numbing, and utterly pointless. The treadwheel represented the purest expression of this philosophy. Prisoners spent hours climbing steps that went nowhere, their exertion producing nothing except their own exhaustion. The psychological impact of completely meaningless labour was profound. Humans can endure tremendous hardship if they believe their efforts serve some purpose. Removing any sense of purpose or accomplishment transformed work into pure torture. Oakum picking became another standard form of prison labour that exemplified the punitive approach. Prisoners received quantities of old rope that they had to untwist fibre by fibre until reduced to loose material that could be used for caulking ships. The work was tedious, painful, and required no skill whatsoever. After days of picking oakum, prisoners had nothing to show except bleeding fingers and piles of fibre that looked identical whether produced by experienced hands or novice ones. The crank was a particularly cruel device that prisoners turned for hours, its resistance adjustable by guards who could make the labour harder or easier at will. Prisoners might be required to complete thousands of revolutions before receiving meals, with guards tightening the resistance if they thought inmates were completing their quotas too easily. This created a system where the amount of suffering required was entirely arbitrary, determined by guards' moods rather than any rational standard. Shot drill involved prisoners moving cannonballs from one pile to another, then moving them back, then repeating the process endlessly. No construction occurred, no useful product emerged, just the pointless transfer of heavy objects that left prisoners exhausted and accomplished nothing. The psychological impact of this deliberate meaninglessness was precisely what authorities intended. They wanted to break spirits through the demonstration that resistance was futile and suffering was the only certain outcome of existence. Even work that might have taught useful skills was structured to prevent any actual learning or development. Prisoners assigned to workshops weren't taught trades in any meaningful sense. They performed repetitive tasks under conditions that prevented understanding of complete processes. A prisoner might spend months attaching the same component to products without ever learning how the component was made or what function it served in the finished item. This approach to labour revealed the fundamental dishonesty in Victorian claims about reformation. If authorities genuinely wanted to reform criminals into productive citizens, they would have provided real vocational training, education in useful skills, preparation for legitimate employment. Instead, they designed work regimens that were deliberately destructive, ensuring that prisoners emerged from incarceration less capable of honest employment than when they entered. The progression through different classes of imprisonment created a facade of rehabilitation that concealed the system's true nature. Prisoners who accumulated sufficient marks and demonstrated adequate submission advanced from separate system to associated system, where they could work alongside other prisoners, though conversation remained prohibited. This progression seemed to offer hope, a path toward eventual restoration of human connection and dignity, but the advancement was conditional and reversible. A single infraction could result in demotion back to complete isolation, erasing months or years of accumulated marks. This kept prisoners in constant anxiety about maintaining their status, afraid to do anything that might be interpreted as resistance or insufficient submission. The possibility of advancement became another control mechanism rather than genuine opportunity for improvement. The associated system itself was hardly a restoration of normal human interaction. Prisoners worked side by side in complete silence, forbidden from acknowledging each other's presence, except through work coordination. Guards patrolled constantly, watching for any signs of communication that might indicate forming friendships or planning resistance. Even eye contact between prisoners was often punished as a violation of rules designed to prevent solidarity. Public works labour represented the highest tier of prisoner status, where inmates might be taken outside prison walls to perform useful labour on road construction or other infrastructure projects. This seemed to offer genuine preparation for post-release life, providing experience in skilled labour while allowing prisoners to see and experience the world beyond stone walls. Yet even this highest privilege remained saturated with control mechanisms designed to prevent prisoners from experiencing it as genuine freedom or dignity. Prisoners on public works laboured under constant armed guard, wearing distinctive clothing that marked them as convicts to any observer. They weren't learning trades through apprenticeship or developing skills through mentorship. They were performing manual labour under conditions that ensured they remained marked as criminals, unworthy of normal human interaction. The medical treatment available within Victorian prisons reveals another dimension of institutional cruelty. Prison doctors existed primarily to determine whether prisoners were capable of enduring punishment, rather than to provide genuine healthcare. Medical examinations focused on fitness for labour and tolerance of isolation, rather than on treating illness or injury. Prisoners who reported sick faced immediate suspicion that they were malingering to avoid work. Prison doctors were trained to assume deception, approaching medical complaints with skepticism rather than care. This meant that genuine illness often went untreated until it became so severe that it couldn't be ignored, by which point permanent damage might already have occurred. The medical philosophy in these institutions held that prisoners deserved minimal care and that suffering was often appropriate punishment for moral failing. Prison doctors might acknowledge that a prisoner was indeed ill, but still declare them fit for labour because the illness wasn't immediately life-threatening. Prisoners worked through fevers, injuries, and chronic conditions that would have justified bed rest in any other context. Mental health was particularly neglected because Victorian medicine barely recognised psychological conditions as legitimate medical concerns. Prisoners who developed symptoms of mental illness, hallucinations, paranoid delusions, catatonic states, were often classified as simply difficult rather than sick. They might be subjected to additional punishment for behaviours that were actually symptoms of psychological breakdown caused by the very conditions authorities imposed. The prison diet deserves examination because it was carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to prevent death while maintaining a state of constant hunger that reinforced prisoners' powerlessness. Meals were monotonous, consisting of bread, gruel, and occasionally vegetables prepared in ways that minimized any pleasure in eating. Portions were measured precisely based on calculations of minimum caloric requirements that didn't account for individual variation or the demands of prison labor. Large men and small women received identical rations regardless of their different nutritional needs. Prisoners engaged in heavy physical labor received the same meals as those confined to cells with minimal activity. The result was chronic hunger that left inmates constantly thinking about food, distracted by physical discomfort even during brief periods when they weren't actively being punished. Food became another control mechanism that authorities wielded strategically. Extra rations might be offered as rewards for exceptional submission, while reductions served as additional punishment for infractions. This made even the basic sustenance required for survival into something prisoners had to earn through proper behaviour rather than something they deserved as human beings. The quality of food was deliberately poor. Bread was often mouldy, gruel was thin and flavourless, vegetables were whatever was cheapest regardless of nutritional value. Meat appeared rarely and was usually gristly, fatty, or partially spoiled. Prisoners learned to eat whatever was provided regardless of quality, because refusing meals meant going even hungrier and might be interpreted as problematic behaviour requiring discipline. These interlocking systems of documentation, meaningless labour, conditional privileges, inadequate medical care, and insufficient nutrition created an environment of total control where every aspect of human existence was regulated, monitored, and weaponized against prisoners' psychological well-being. The cumulative psychological impact of these conditions manifested in ways that Victorian authorities either failed to recognize or deliberately ignored. Prisoners began displaying symptoms that modern psychology would identify as severe trauma responses, but which 19th century officials dismissed as weakness, defiance, or moral corruption, requiring additional correction. Sleep became nearly impossible under these conditions. Cells remained cold throughout the night, and the thin blankets provided offered minimal warmth. Prisoners shivered through winter nights, their bodies never fully resting, because some part of their consciousness remained focused on the physical discomfort of cold. During summer, the opposite problem emerged as cells became stifling without ventilation, leaving prisoners gasping in stale air that grew increasingly oppressive as temperatures rose. But temperature represented only one obstacle to sleep. The psychological weight of isolation pressed down with particular intensity during nighttime hours, when darkness eliminated even the minimal visual stimulation of staring at cell walls. Prisoners lay awake in absolute blackness, their minds racing through the same circular thoughts that had occupied them during daylight hours, but now amplified by the heightened anxiety that darkness produces in humans deprived of all comfort and security. Guards conducted nighttime inspections at irregular intervals, deliberately unpredictable, to prevent prisoners from adapting to any pattern. The sound of footsteps in corridors would trigger immediate tension, as prisoners wondered whether their cell would be the one selected for inspection. Even those not inspected would be awakened by the sounds of locks being turned and cell doors opening elsewhere in the block. The possibility of inspection meant prisoners could never fully relax into sleep, maintaining a state of hypervigilance that prevented genuine rest. This chronic sleep deprivation compounded every other difficulty prisoners faced. Exhausted minds became less capable of maintaining the psychological defenses necessary for surviving isolation. Tasks that required concentration became nearly impossible when prisoners couldn't focus their thoughts for more than brief periods. The crank labor that demanded counting revolutions became torture when exhausted prisoners lost count repeatedly and had to start over, knowing each mistake would extend the time required to complete their quota. Physical coordination deteriorated as well. Exhausted prisoners stumbled more frequently during exercise periods, fumbled with tools during work assignments, and struggled to maintain the precise movements required for various prison tasks. Each mistake brought punishment, creating a vicious cycle where sleep deprivation led to errors that produced additional stress that further disrupted sleep. Some prisoners developed what we would now recognize as dissociative states, where consciousness seemed to split between their physical presence in the cell and some other realm their minds created as escape from intolerable reality. They would lose time, suddenly realizing hours had passed without any memory of how they spent them. Others experienced the opposite, becoming hyper-aware of every passing second as time seemed to slow to an excruciating crawl. Hallucinations became common, particularly auditory ones that seemed to emerge from the silence itself. Prisoners heard voices calling their names, conversations happening just beyond their hearing, or music that wasn't being played. Some heard the voices of family members, creating cruel moments of hope, followed by crushing disappointment when they recognized these sounds as products of their deteriorating mental state, rather than actual contact with the outside world. Visual hallucinations appeared less frequently, but with greater intensity when they occurred. Shadows in cells seemed to move with purpose, rather than following natural light patterns. Prisoners saw figures standing in corners or sitting on their beds, sometimes recognizable as people from their past, other times appearing as strangers or abstract shapes that defied description. These hallucinations felt completely real in the moment, and prisoners might spend minutes or hours convinced they were sharing their cell with another presence before reality reasserted itself. The boundary between sleeping and waking became increasingly blurred, as prisoners could no longer reliably distinguish between dreams, hallucinations, and actual experiences. They might believe they had completed their work quota, only to discover they had imagined the entire thing. Or they would remember conversations with guards that never actually happened, creating confusion about what rules they had been given or what punishments they faced. This psychological deterioration was exactly what the separate system was designed to produce, though authorities would never have admitted this explicitly. The theory held that isolation would force prisoners to confront their moral failings and emerge reformed. But what actually happened was that isolation destroyed the psychological structures that allow humans to maintain coherent identity and functional reasoning. Prisoners lost their sense of self in fundamental ways. They forgot what their own faces looked like because mirrors were forbidden. Their voices sounded strange when they were occasionally permitted to speak because they had gone so long without hearing themselves talk. Some prisoners reported feeling as though they were observing their own bodies from outside themselves, watching their hands perform tasks without feeling connected to those movements. The loss of temporal awareness became particularly severe. Without regular interaction with others or variation in daily routine, prisoners couldn't maintain accurate sense of how much time had passed. Days blurred together into undifferentiated stretches of sameness. Prisoners might believe they had been confined for years when only months had elapsed, or conversely, might be shocked to learn that far more time had passed than they remembered experiencing. This temporal confusion was worsened by the deliberate absence of calendars or any means of tracking dates. Prisoners didn't know what day of the week it was, what month they were in, or how much of their sentence remained. Some prisons intentionally gave prisoners incorrect information about their release dates, telling them they had longer remaining than was actually true, creating devastating disappointment when prisoners believed they were approaching freedom only to be informed they had calculated incorrectly. The few moments when prisoners were allowed limited interaction with others became charged with desperate intensity. Chapel services, where prisoners sat in separated compartments but could at least see other human beings, provided brief relief from total isolation. Prisoners strained to make eye contact with others, seeking any acknowledgement of their existence as human beings, rather than the numbered units the prison system treated them as. But even these minimal interactions were carefully controlled to prevent prisoners from deriving too much comfort from them. Chapel compartments were designed so prisoners could see the chaplain but not each other, preventing any sense of community or solidarity from developing. Guards watched constantly for any attempt at communication, ready to punish prisoners who tried to exchange glances or subtle gestures. Exercise periods theoretically offered another opportunity for human contact, but these too were structured to prevent meaningful interaction. Prisoners walked in separate circles or in single file with strict rules against speaking or making gestures. The exercise yard became just another location where isolation continued, surrounded by other isolated individuals, but unable to bridge the gaps between them. This prevention of community was deliberate policy, based on authorities' fear that prisoners might support each other emotionally or organize resistance to prison conditions. Any solidarity between prisoners represented a threat to the total control that the separate system required to function. Therefore, even the minimal human contact that occurred had to be structured to prevent relationships from forming. Letters provided the only genuine connection to the outside world. But these too were weaponized as control mechanisms. Prisoners were permitted to write and receive limited correspondence. But every letter was read by authorities who censored anything deemed inappropriate. Prisoners learned to write in careful, guarded language that wouldn't trigger censorship. But this meant letters couldn't convey genuine emotional states or describe actual prison conditions. Receiving letters from family brought both comfort and additional pain. Learning that loved ones were struggling financially without the prisoner's income, that children were asking when their parent would return home, that relatives were ill or dying, all of this information reached prisoners without any ability to respond meaningfully or provide support. The letters proved that life continued outside the prison walls, but emphasized how completely prisoners were cut off from participating in that life. Worse, letters might be delayed or withheld entirely as punishment for infractions. Prisoners never knew whether absence of correspondence meant family had stopped writing or authorities were simply not delivering the letters. This uncertainty created additional anxiety as prisoners wondered whether they had been forgotten or whether their loved ones were trying to reach them but being thwarted by prison policies. The few visitors permitted faced such restrictions that visits often caused more distress than comfort. Conversations happened through barriers that prevented physical contact, supervised by guards who would end visits immediately if prohibited topics were discussed. Prisoners and visitors had to speak loudly to be heard through the barriers, eliminating any possibility of private conversation, while simultaneously making emotional discussions more difficult because of the artificial shouted quality of communication. Children who visited often didn't recognize parents they hadn't seen in months or years. The strange environment, the barriers, the presence of guards, all of this terrified young children who couldn't understand why they couldn't touch their parent or why they had to speak through screens and bars. Parents watched their children cry or cling to other relatives, unable to comfort them or explain in age-appropriate terms why this separation was necessary. Visits ended abruptly when the allotted time expired, regardless of whether conversations had reached natural conclusions. Guards would interrupt mid-sentence, ordering visitors to leave immediately. Prisoners returned to their cells carrying the emotional weight of these truncated interactions, replaying conversations and thinking of all the things they hadn't had time to say. The knowledge that weeks or months might pass before the next visit meant these brief encounters had to sustain prisoners through long stretches of total isolation. The arbitrary nature of prison discipline added another layer of psychological torment. Rules were extensive and often contradictory, creating situations where prisoners couldn't avoid infractions regardless of how carefully they tried to comply. A prisoner might be punished for completing work too slowly one day and then punished for working too quickly the next day, because authorities decided speed indicated insufficient care in performing the task. This unpredictability made it impossible to develop strategies for avoiding punishment. There was no safe course of action because the same behavior might be acceptable one day and punishable the next, depending on individual guards' moods or administrators' changing interpretations of regulations. Prisoners lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing whether their current actions would result in punishment until consequences arrived. The punishment system itself operated according to a twisted logic that multiplied suffering. Minor infractions might result in loss of already minimal privileges, reduction in food rations, cancellation of exercise periods, prohibition of letter writing. But these punishments made subsequent compliance more difficult because weakened, isolated prisoners were less capable of meeting the demands placed upon them. More serious infractions resulted in periods of even stricter isolation in punishment cells that made regular confinement seem almost comfortable by comparison. These special cells eliminated the few minor comforts permitted in standard cells. Prisoners might lose their mattresses, forcing them to sleep on bare boards, or they might lose the ability to have any reading material, removing even the minimal mental stimulation that books provided. Some punishment cells were completely dark 24 hours a day, eliminating the natural light cycle that helped prisoners maintain any sense of time. Duration of these punishments was left to authorities' discretion, creating uncertainty that was itself a form of torture. Prisoners didn't know whether their punishment would last days or weeks. Each day in punishment cells felt interminable, and not knowing when release would come made the experience even more unbearable. Some prisoners emerged from punishment cells showing obvious signs of psychological breakdown, vacant expressions, inability to speak coherently, or explosive emotional responses to minor stimuli. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the punishment system was how it forced prisoners to internalize their oppression. The constant documentation, the elaborate justifications for each punishment, the insistence that prisoners acknowledge their infractions, All of this created psychological pressure to accept the system's judgment of them as fundamentally flawed individuals deserving of suffering. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual punishment into systematic campaigns designed to destroy prisoners' sense of identity and self-worth. Authorities understood that breaking someone's spirit was more effective than simply confining their body. They developed elaborate techniques for attacking the core of who prisoners believed themselves to be. Forced confessions represented one of the most insidious methods. Prisoners were required to write detailed accounts of their crimes, real or imagined, with authorities rejecting submissions that didn't meet their standards for self-condemnation. These weren't simple acknowledgements of breaking laws. They were extensive autobiographical documents in which prisoners had to analyze their entire lives through the lens of their supposed moral failings. A prisoner arrested for unauthorized political activity might be required to trace the roots of their criminality back through their entire personal history. They had to identify moments from childhood that supposedly revealed nascent antisocial tendencies. They analyzed their education for evidence of corrupting influences. They examined their friendships and relationships for signs of moral weakness that led to their eventual crimes. This process could take months or even years. Authorities would reject confession after confession as insufficient, demanding greater depth of self-criticism and more thorough denunciation of the prisoner's former beliefs and associates. Each rejection came with specific instructions about what the next version needed to include. The psychological impact was devastating. Prisoners found themselves spending hours each day writing elaborate critiques of their own character, repeatedly affirming that they deserved punishment and that the system treating them so harshly was actually being merciful by offering opportunities for redemption through suffering. Some prisoners internalized these forced confessions to a degree that shocked even the authorities. They became genuinely convinced of their own moral depravity, viewing their imprisonment not as unjust persecution, but as appropriate consequences for their failings. This complete psychological capitulation represented the system's ultimate victory. But even prisoners who resisted this internalization suffered profound psychological damage from the confession process. The act of repeatedly writing detailed condemnations of oneself, even when done cynically to satisfy authorities, created cognitive dissonance that was difficult to manage. Human minds struggle to maintain clear boundaries between performances and genuine beliefs when the performances are repeated frequently and under conditions of extreme stress. The requirement to denounce other people added another layer of moral injury. Prisoners had to name associates, describe their activities, and explain how these relationships contributed to the prisoner's criminal behavior. This forced betrayal of friends and family members created guilt that many prisoners found harder to bear than their physical suffering. Some prisoners tried to protect others by providing false information or naming people who were already imprisoned or deceased. But authorities often possessed enough information to detect these deceptions, and the consequences for attempting them were severe. Prisoners faced impossible choices between betraying people they cared about or accepting punishments that might destroy their ability to survive imprisonment. Those who chose to protect others by refusing to provide names paid enormous prices for their loyalty. Extended isolation, reduced rations, brutal interrogations, these consequences accumulated until some prisoners reached breaking points where they surrendered information just to make the pressure stop. The guilt from eventually capitulating after trying to resist often felt worse than if they had cooperated immediately. Prisoners who did provide information about others had to live with knowledge of what their words might have caused. They didn't know whether their statements led to other arrests, but the possibility haunted them. Some rationalized their cooperation by telling themselves that authorities already knew everything and the information wasn't actually harmful. Others convinced themselves that survival required these compromises and that they would somehow make amends after their release. The system created communities of people who couldn't fully trust each other because everyone knew that anyone might have been forced to inform on others. This breakdown of trust was itself a form of control. Prisoners who might otherwise have supported each other emotionally were kept isolated by suspicion and guilt. Religious and political beliefs became particular targets for systematic attack. Authorities understood that these convictions often provided prisoners with frameworks for maintaining dignity and hope despite their circumstances. Destroying these belief systems meant removing crucial sources of psychological resilience. Prisoners with religious faith were required to study atheistic materials and write essays explaining why their religious beliefs were false and harmful. They had to attend lectures denouncing religion and participate in group sessions where they publicly renounced their faith. Those who refused faced escalating consequences until compliance or complete psychological breakdown. The attack on religious belief was designed to remove not just the specific doctrines prisoners held, but the entire framework of meaning those beliefs provided. Without spiritual explanations for suffering or hope for ultimate justice, prisoners were left with raw experience of cruelty that had no redemptive purpose. Political prisoners faced similar systematic campaigns against their convictions. They were forced to study official ideology and write self-criticisms explaining how their political views had been misguided. They had to publicly praise the very system that imprisoned them and denounce the causes they had supported. Some prisoners maintained secret resistance in their minds, even while their mouths spoke required words. They told themselves that forced statements made under duress didn't represent their true beliefs. But this psychological compartmentalization became harder to maintain over time as the gap between what they said and what they privately believed created mounting internal tension. The isolation from external information made this psychological warfare even more effective. Prisoners had no access to news that might contradict what authorities told them about the outside world. They couldn't verify claims that their causes had failed, that their organizations had disbanded, that people they cared about had denounced them. This information vacuum meant prisoners had no way to reality test the narratives authorities constructed. Maybe their political movements really had collapsed. Maybe their religious communities really had abandoned them. Maybe everyone they knew really did believe they deserved imprisonment. Without contrary evidence, even prisoners who tried to resist psychological manipulation found doubts creeping into their thinking. The most resilient prisoners developed mental strategies for preserving their sense of self despite these attacks. Some created elaborate memory palaces in their minds where they stored important experiences and relationships that reminded them of who they had been before imprisonment. They would mentally revisit these memories during the long, empty hours, reinforcing their connection to identities that authorities were trying to destroy. Others maintained hope through fantasies about the future. They imagined their eventual release and return to normal life in such detail that these visions became psychological anchors. They planned what they would do first upon release, how they would reconnect with loved ones, how they would rebuild their lives. These future-focused thoughts provided something to endure for, even when present circumstances seemed unendurable. Some prisoners found strength in small acts of resistance that authorities couldn't detect or prevent. They might deliberately misunderstand instructions, creating minor inefficiencies in the prison system. They might provide technically accurate but ultimately useless information during interrogations. They might maintain private thoughts that directly contradicted what they were forced to say aloud. These tiny rebellions had no practical impact on the system, but they had enormous psychological significance for the prisoners who engaged in them. Each small act of resistance was a way of asserting that despite everything, they retained some capacity for independent action. They weren't completely broken, completely controlled, completely transformed into the obedient subjects authorities wanted to create. But even these mental resistance strategies came at costs. The psychological effort required to maintain separate public and private selves was exhausting. The constant vigilance needed to avoid revealing true thoughts or feelings created stress that accumulated over months and years. Some prisoners found that the protective walls they built around their inner selves eventually became so thick that they lost touch with their own authentic feelings. The few prisoners who managed to maintain psychological resilience often did so by finding meaning in their suffering. They reframed their imprisonment as a test of character or a sacrifice for important causes. This meaning-making transformed their experience from senseless cruelty into something that had purpose, even if that purpose was simply demonstrating that the human spirit couldn't be completely crushed. Religious prisoners often interpreted their suffering through theological frameworks that gave it redemptive meaning. Political prisoners sometimes viewed their imprisonment as martyrdom for their causes. Even prisoners without these existing frameworks sometimes created new philosophical systems that made sense of their experiences. This search for meaning was both protective and dangerous. It helped prisoners maintain dignity and hope, but it also risked creating psychological investments in narratives that might not withstand the eventual return to normal life. Prisoners who had convinced themselves that their suffering served important purposes sometimes struggled after release when they discovered that their imprisonments hadn't actually advanced any causes or proven anything to anyone except themselves. The daily routine of psychological manipulation was punctuated by periodic escalations designed to prevent prisoners from adapting too successfully to their circumstances. Just when someone developed coping strategies that made daily life barely tolerable, authorities would introduce new forms of pressure that required developing entirely new ways of managing. A prisoner who had learned to endure isolation might suddenly be placed in a crowded cell with hostile inmates. Someone who had adjusted to physical labor might be transferred to mind-numbing make-work that provided no sense of accomplishment. Prisoners who had found comfort in routine would have their schedules completely disrupted. These deliberate disruptions kept prisoners off balance and prevented the development of stable psychological defenses. The message was clear: no adaptation would be permitted to succeed for long. No coping strategy would be allowed to provide lasting relief. The system would always find new ways to create suffering. Some prisoners experienced these escalations as worse than the baseline conditions of imprisonment because they destroyed hope that adjustment was possible. If every adaptation led to new attacks, what was the point of trying to cope? This learned helplessness became its own form of psychological breakdown, leaving prisoners passive and defeated, even when opportunities for small resistances presented themselves. The psychological toll accumulated differently for different prisoners, depending on their backgrounds, personalities, and the specific circumstances of their imprisonment. But virtually everyone showed signs of damage. The question wasn't whether imprisonment harmed people psychologically, but how severe that harm became and whether it could ever be fully healed. Physical survival through years of imprisonment required a body that could endure malnutrition, harsh conditions, and the physical toll of forced labor. But psychological survival required something more fragile and harder to define, some core sense of self that authorities couldn't completely destroy, no matter how systematically they attacked it. The prisoners who eventually emerged from these institutions carried scars from both types of damage, physical and psychological, that would never completely fade. The transformation of time inside these institutions created perhaps the most disorienting aspect of long-term imprisonment. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years until the calendar itself became meaningless. Prisoners lost track of seasons, forgot what year it was, couldn't remember how long they'd been confined. This temporal disintegration wasn't accidental. It was systematically engineered through the removal of all normal time markers that help people maintain their connection to the outside world. No clocks were visible. Windows, when they existed, were positioned to prevent seeing the sky. The rhythm of meals, work assignments, and cell checks followed schedules that deliberately avoided natural daily patterns. Sometimes breakfast came at what felt like evening. Work shifts might last 15 hours or 3 hours with no apparent logic. Sleep periods were interrupted randomly or extended unpredictably. Without external reference points, the body's internal clock began to malfunction. Prisoners experienced something similar to permanent jet lag as their circadian rhythms struggled to find patterns in the chaos. Sleep became difficult even during designated rest periods. Alertness faded during work assignments. The boundary between waking and sleeping grew fuzzy as exhaustion accumulated over months and years. This temporal confusion had profound psychological effects beyond simple disorientation. Human identity depends partly on experiencing oneself as existing through time with a past that connects to a present that points toward a future. When time itself became incomprehensible, that sense of continuous identity began to fragment. Prisoners forgot significant events from their lives before imprisonment. Childhood memories that had once been vivid became hazy or disappeared entirely. The faces of family members grew indistinct. Important relationships that had defined who they were seemed to belong to someone else entirely, some previous version of themselves that no longer existed. Equally disturbing was the inability to imagine any future beyond the walls. The idea of eventual release became abstract and unreal even for prisoners who knew their sentences would end. They couldn't picture themselves in normal life because they'd lost the cognitive ability to project themselves forward through time in any meaningful way. Some prisoners coped with this temporal disintegration by creating artificial time structures. They counted days by scratching marks on walls or keeping mental tallies. They tracked seasons by tiny changes in temperature or food quality. They created calendars in their minds and clung to them despite having no way to verify their accuracy. These personal timekeeping systems were fragile and easily disrupted by transfers between facilities. Stays in punishment cells or periods of illness when counting became impossible. Prisoners who had carefully tracked hundreds of days might lose count during a week of fever and find themselves completely adrift again, unable to reconstruct what they'd lost. Others abandoned the attempt to track time entirely, choosing instead to exist in an eternal present that required no reference to past or future. This psychological adaptation had advantages. It eliminated the torture of counting endless days toward release dates that might never come. But it also represented a fundamental surrender of the temporal dimension that makes human consciousness distinct from animal awareness. The loss of future orientation particularly damaged prisoners' ability to maintain motivation for self-preservation. Why eat inadequate food that barely sustained life if there was no future to preserve oneself for? Why resist disease or injury if tomorrow was indistinguishable from today, and both were indistinguishable from forever? Prison authorities exploited this temporal disorientation during interrogations and indoctrination sessions. They presented the prisoner's current suffering as eternal and unchangeable, while offering ideology or confession as the only possible escape into a different kind of time. The message was clear. Normal time had ended when imprisonment began, and only submission could restart it. Yet some prisoners discovered that temporal disintegration, while disorienting, also provided unexpected forms of freedom. Without the pressure of future plans or the burden of past regrets, they could focus entirely on the immediate present moment. This unintentional mindfulness sometimes reduced suffering by eliminating the anguish of comparing current circumstances to remembered better times or hoped for futures. The weather patterns that prisoners could occasionally glimpse through high windows or feel through changes in temperature became precious markers of passing time. The first cold wind of autumn, or the particular quality of spring light filtering through cracks, took on enormous significance as proof that time was still moving, even if prisoners couldn't track it accurately. These seasonal signals were often the only confirmation prisoners had that they still existed in the same temporal universe as the outside world. The knowledge that autumn was arriving meant that somewhere beyond the walls, leaves were changing colour, people were preparing for holidays, life was continuing its normal cycles, even if prisoners were excluded from them. The psychological impact of temporal disorientation compounded all the other forms of damage prisoners experienced. It made isolation more complete by severing connections not just to other people, but to the flow of time itself. It made physical suffering more unbearable by eliminating any sense of progression toward an endpoint. It made identity more fragile by destroying the temporal continuity that holds personality together. Guards and administrators who maintained these systems rarely experienced the temporal disintegration they inflicted on prisoners. They worked shifts that followed normal clocks, went home to families, participated in the regular rhythms of society. Their ability to move between the timeless prison world and normal temporal existence gave them yet another form of power over prisoners who had no such mobility. The dehumanization that pervaded every aspect of these institutions represented perhaps the most deliberate and systematic cruelty. Prisoners weren't simply confined or punished. They were methodically stripped of the characteristics that made them recognizably human until they became something less in the eyes of both their captors and eventually themselves. Names disappeared first, replaced by numbers that reduced identity to administrative convenience. The number became how guards addressed prisoners, how records tracked them, how they learned to think of themselves. Some prisoners forgot their own names after years of hearing only their assigned numbers. Personal possessions vanished at intake. Photographs, letters, small objects that connected prisoners to their lives before confinement were confiscated and destroyed. The message was explicit. Your previous life no longer exists. Those connections are severed. You are now only what we define you to be. Clothing reinforced this erasure of individual identity. Standardized uniforms made everyone look similar, while simultaneously marking them as prisoners, as less than the guards and administrators who wore normal clothes. The uniforms were often deliberately ill-fitting, too large or too small, in colors that were intentionally ugly and dehumanizing. Haircuts followed similar logic. Heads were shaved not for hygiene, but to eliminate another marker of individual identity and choice. The act of forced shaving was itself humiliating, treating prisoners like livestock being processed rather than people deserving basic dignity. Privacy disappeared completely. Toilets in cells lacked partitions or doors. Showers were communal and supervised. Medical examinations were conducted with no consideration for modesty or personal boundaries. Guards entered cells at any time without warning. Every bodily function became public, stripping away the privacy that humans need to maintain their sense of individual dignity. Language itself was weaponized to reinforce dehumanization. Guards referred to prisoners using animal terminology or terms normally reserved for objects. Prisoners were it rather than he or she. They were things to be moved, processed, managed. This linguistic dehumanization made it psychologically easier for guards to treat prisoners cruelly by verbally denying their humanity before each physical abuse. The denial of personal agency took this dehumanization even further. Prisoners couldn't make the smallest decisions about their own lives. When they slept, what they ate, how they spent every moment was determined by authorities. They couldn't choose to read, to exercise, to speak, to remain silent. Every action required permission that was often arbitrarily denied. This complete removal of choice gradually eroded prisoners' sense of themselves as autonomous beings capable of making decisions. They became passive recipients of whatever was done to them, losing the internal sense of agency that's fundamental to human psychology. Some prisoners described feeling like they were watching things happen to their bodies from outside themselves, as if they'd become objects being manipulated rather than subjects with their own will. The prohibition against prisoners looking guards directly in the eyes enforced status hierarchies that went beyond normal power differentials. Prisoners had to avert their gaze, keeping their eyes down like subordinate animals. This rule was enforced through immediate punishment for any perceived challenge. The inability to meet another person's eyes cut prisoners off from one of the most basic forms of human recognition and connection. Medical care when provided at all, was delivered in ways that emphasized prisoners' subhuman status. Doctors showed no compassion, conducted examinations roughly, discussed prisoners' conditions in front of them as if they couldn't understand or didn't matter. Medical treatment was framed as maintaining state property rather than caring for human beings who were suffering. Even the small acts of resistance that prisoners attempted were systematically crushed in ways designed to demonstrate their powerlessness. A prisoner who tried to maintain dignity through proper posture would be forced into humiliating positions. Someone who tried to keep their cell clean would have it deliberately trashed by guards. Any attempt to assert individuality or autonomy triggered responses that proved prisoners controlled nothing, not even their responses to their own dehumanization. The psychological impact of sustained dehumanization was catastrophic for many prisoners. They began to internalize the messages they received constantly, that they were worthless, subhuman, deserving of whatever was done to them. This internalized dehumanization could be more damaging than the external treatment because it destroyed prisoners' ability to maintain any positive self-concept that might sustain them through their ordeal. Some prisoners fought desperately against this internalization, clinging to memories of who they had been before imprisonment, reminding themselves of their names and identities when alone in their cells. But this resistance required enormous psychological energy that depleted reserves needed for physical survival. The choice between maintaining one's humanity and conserving strength for basic survival became agonizing. Other prisoners surrendered to dehumanization as a form of psychological protection. If they accepted that they were no longer fully human, then being treated as less than human couldn't hurt them anymore. This surrender brought a kind of peace, but at the cost of potentially permanent damage to their sense of self. The few prisoners who maintained their humanity through years of systematic dehumanization did so through extraordinary psychological resilience, and often through finding ways to perform small acts that affirmed their human status, even when no one else acknowledged it. They might recite poetry to themselves, create art in their minds, maintain mental conversations with absent loved ones, anything that required uniquely human cognitive abilities that their captors couldn't strip away. Religious and philosophical frameworks provided some prisoners with conceptual tools for resisting dehumanization. If human dignity was inherent and God-given or grounded in philosophical principles, then it couldn't be destroyed by external treatment, no matter how degrading. This intellectual resistance allowed some prisoners to maintain internal conviction of their own humanity, even while their bodies were treated like objects. The long-term psychological effects of sustained dehumanization extended far beyond imprisonment itself. Former prisoners often struggled for years or decades to rebuild their sense of themselves as full human beings, deserving of respect and dignity. The damage to their fundamental self-concept required extensive psychological work to heal, and some wounds never fully closed. Guard behavior toward prisoners existed on a spectrum from professional detachment to active sadism. Some guards treated their work as simply a job, following rules without particular cruelty, but also without compassion. They processed prisoners efficiently, enforced regulations consistently, and went home without thinking much about the people whose lives they controlled. Other guards found satisfaction or even pleasure in the power they wielded over helpless prisoners. They invented reasons to punish, created arbitrary rules designed to be impossible to follow, and responded to the smallest perceived disrespect with disproportionate violence. For these guards, the cruelty was the point, an opportunity to exercise absolute power over others with no consequences for abuse. The psychology underlying this sadistic behavior was complex and disturbing. For some guards, the opportunity to dominate others compensated for feelings of powerlessness in their own lives. By making prisoners suffer, they could experience themselves as powerful and important, someone whose smallest gesture could determine whether another person ate or starved, lived or died. This compensation mechanism was particularly evident in guards who came from disadvantaged backgrounds themselves. Having experienced subordination and humiliation in civilian society, they relished the opportunity to inflict similar experiences on others. The prison hierarchy inverted their normal social position, transforming them from society's bottom to absolute rulers within their limited domain. Other guards experienced their sadism as a form of moral righteousness. They genuinely believed prisoners deserved whatever suffering was inflicted because of their crimes or their inherent inferiority. This moral framework allowed guards to torture with clear consciences, viewing their cruelty as justified punishment rather than abuse. The most disturbing aspect of guard psychology was how ordinary people could be transformed into torturers through institutional processes that normalized cruelty. Guards who began their careers with no particular sadistic tendencies could gradually become comfortable with violence through incremental exposure and peer pressure from more experienced colleagues. A new guard might initially feel uncomfortable watching experienced colleagues beat prisoners, but after witnessing such violence dozens of times without consequences, the discomfort faded. Eventually, participating in the violence themselves felt like a natural part of the job, just another task to complete during their shift. This transformation didn't require inherently evil people. It required only institutional structures that removed normal social restraints against violence, peer cultures that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, and ideological frameworks that defined victims as deserving their treatment. The Stanford prison experiment demonstrated these dynamics in controlled conditions. Ordinary college students randomly assigned to play guards began exhibiting genuinely sadistic behavior within days. They invented humiliating rituals, punished prisoners for arbitrary infractions, and seemed to take pleasure in exercising power over their helpless charges. When researchers ended the experiment early due to the severity of abuse, many guards expressed disappointment. They had begun enjoying their roles and the power that came with them. This disturbing finding suggested that institutional roles and situational factors could override individual moral character more easily than most people wanted to believe. Real-world prison systems amplified these dynamics through selection effects that concentrated individuals comfortable with violence into guard positions, training programs that emphasize control over rehabilitation, and organizational cultures that protected abusive guards from consequences. Guards who expressed excessive compassion for prisoners faced mockery from colleagues, accusations of weakness, and sometimes formal discipline for failing to maintain appropriate professional distance. These social pressures shaped behavior more powerfully than any official regulations about humane treatment. The few guards who maintained genuine humanity toward prisoners despite these pressures did so through exceptional moral courage and often at significant personal cost. They might face ostracism from colleagues, assignment to undesirable shifts, or even threats and violence from fellow guards who viewed their compassion as betrayal. Some humane guards developed covert strategies for helping prisoners without attracting attention from sadistic colleagues. They might enforce rules selectively, looking the other way when prisoners violated regulations that seemed arbitrary or cruel. They might pass along information that helped prisoners avoid the worst abuses, or intervene subtly to prevent violence without appearing to challenge other guards directly. These small acts of humanity could have profound effects on prisoners whose entire existence consisted of degradation and suffering. A guard who addressed a prisoner by name rather than number, who acknowledged their humanity through a brief moment of eye contact or a secretly passed extra portion of food. These tiny gestures of recognition could sustain hope when everything else suggested despair was the only rational response. But such guards remained rare exceptions in systems designed to produce the opposite behavior. The structural incentives, cultural norms, and psychological dynamics of prison guard work consistently push toward dehumanization and cruelty rather than compassion and reform. The relationship between prisoners and guards was further complicated by the fact that both groups existed within larger institutional structures that constrained everyone's behaviour. Guards who might personally question certain practices often felt powerless to change policies determined by distant administrators or political authorities. This diffusion of responsibility allowed individuals at every level to avoid feeling personally accountable for the system's cruelty. Guards could blame prison administrators for harsh policies. Administrators could blame political leaders for demanding punitive approaches. Politicians could blame public opinion for demanding tough-on-crime stances. Everyone pointed to someone else as the real source of the problem. The result was a system where terrible suffering was inflicted systematically without any individual feeling fully responsible for it. This organizational structure proved remarkably effective at enabling atrocities while allowing everyone involved to maintain their self-image as decent people just doing their jobs. Breaking this cycle required individuals willing to accept personal responsibility for their actions, regardless of institutional pressures. Guards who refused to participate in torture even when ordered. Administrators who implemented humane policies despite political pressure. Politicians who defended prisoner rights even when it cost them votes. Such moral courage remained extraordinarily rare because the personal costs could be devastating. A guard who refused to beat prisoners might lose their job and face retaliation from former colleagues. An administrator who pushed too hard for reforms might be fired and blacklisted from similar positions. A politician who defended prisoner rights often lost elections to opponents who promised harsher treatment. The few individuals who paid these costs to act according to their conscience provided crucial evidence that the system's cruelty was not inevitable. Their examples demonstrated that human choice remained possible even within structures designed to eliminate it. Medical staff in prisons face particular ethical dilemmas that highlighted the contradictions inherent in institutions dedicated to punishment rather than care. Doctors and nurses were supposed to heal and protect health, yet they worked within systems designed to inflict suffering and maintain control through fear. Some medical personnel resolved this contradiction by prioritizing their institutional role over their medical ethics. They treated only the most acute medical problems while ignoring chronic conditions and suffering that didn't threaten immediate death. They certified prisoners as fit for torture or execution. They even participated directly in abuse by withholding pain medication, performing unnecessary examinations, or using medical knowledge to maximize suffering while avoiding death. This corruption of medical ethics represented a profound betrayal of the fundamental principles that were supposed to govern healthcare. The Hippocratic Oath's commitment to, first, do no harm, became meaningless when doctors used their expertise to calibrate precisely how much harm could be inflicted without killing the victim. Other medical staff maintained their ethical commitments despite institutional pressures, advocating for humane treatment and refusing to participate in abuse. These principled practitioners often faced severe consequences for their integrity: dismissal from their positions, professional ostracism, or worse. The tension between medical ethics and institutional demands created agonizing choices for healthcare workers who wanted to help prisoners but couldn't fundamentally change the systems that produce their suffering. A doctor might provide excellent care for injuries from torture while being unable to prevent future torture. A nurse might treat malnutrition while being powerless to improve the starvation diet that caused it. These limitations could lead to moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from participating in or witnessing actions that violate one's core values. Medical staff who maintained their ethical principles while working in abusive institutions often experienced profound distress from the gap between what they knew should happen and what actually occurred. The presence of medical personnel in prisons served important propaganda functions for authorities, seeking to present their institutions as humane despite evidence to the contrary. Officials could point to medical facilities and healthcare staff as proof that prisoners received adequate care, even when the reality bore no resemblance to this claim. This propaganda function sometimes led authorities to invest in visible medical infrastructure, clean clinics, modern equipment, properly credentialed staff, while simultaneously ensuring that this infrastructure served primarily cosmetic purposes rather than genuine healthcare delivery. Prisoners learned to navigate these contradictions, identifying which medical staff could be trusted and which were essentially extensions of the guard force. A doctor who reported prisoner complaints to guards rather than treating them became someone to avoid unless absolutely necessary. A nurse who showed genuine compassion became a precious resource to be protected through careful discretion. The corruption of medical ethics in prison settings reflected broader patterns of how institutional pressures could override professional commitments and personal morality. Doctors, like guards, could be transformed from healers into accomplices of abuse through structures that rewarded compliance and punished integrity. Religious personnel in prisons faced similar contradictions, though the specific dynamics differed from medical staff. Chaplains were supposed to provide spiritual comfort and advocate for human dignity, yet they worked within institutions dedicated to degradation and punishment. Some chaplains became apologists for the system, preaching sermons about obedience to authority and accepting suffering as divine will. They provided spiritual justifications for prisoners' torment, suggesting their punishment represented God's judgment or a necessary purification of their souls. This theological framework served institutional interests perfectly by encouraging prisoner submission while giving religious legitimacy to their suffering. Chaplains who preached such messages received administrative support and access to prisoners, while those who challenged the system's ethics faced restrictions or expulsion. Other chaplains maintained their commitment to religious principles that emphasized human dignity, compassion, and justice. They advocated for better treatment, documented abuses, and provided prisoners with spiritual resources for maintaining hope and humanity despite their circumstances. These principled chaplains often paid significant costs for their integrity. They might be barred from certain facilities, have their access to prisoners restricted, or face pressure from religious hierarchies to moderate their criticism of prison conditions. The most effective religious personnel developed strategies for subverting the system's cruelty while avoiding direct confrontation that would end their access. They might preach publicly about obedience while privately encouraging prisoners to maintain their dignity. They might appear to support institutional goals while actually working to undermine the worst abuses through subtle interventions. This kind of strategic resistance required considerable moral courage and sophisticated judgment about when compromise served larger purposes and when it simply enabled further abuse. The line between tactical flexibility and complicity could be difficult to discern. Prisoners' own religious practices provided crucial psychological resources for surviving their ordeals. Prayer, meditation, and religious rituals offered ways to maintain internal autonomy, even when every external aspect of life was controlled. Religious frameworks that emphasized spiritual freedom could help prisoners maintain their sense of self, despite systematic efforts to destroy it. Shared religious practices also created opportunities for solidarity and community among prisoners who were otherwise isolated from each other. Secret prayer groups passed religious texts, whispered blessings. These covert expressions of faith built connections that helped prisoners resist the atomizing effects of their imprisonment. Authorities recognized the subversive potential of religious practice and often tried to suppress or control it. Prisoners might be forbidden to pray, denied access to religious texts, or punished for participating in worship. These restrictions revealed how even apparently private spiritual activities threatened institutional control by creating spaces beyond the system's reach. The interplay between institutional power and various forms of resistance, medical, religious, personal, created complex dynamics where outcomes remained uncertain. Systems designed to crush human spirit sometimes succeeded completely, breaking prisoners so thoroughly that they never recovered. But sometimes prisoners found resources for survival and even resistance that authorities couldn't eliminate, despite their overwhelming power. Understanding these dynamics required recognizing that human responses to extreme situations varied enormously. Some prisoners collaborated with their oppressors, some resisted heroically, most fell somewhere in between, trying to survive without either complete surrender or suicidal resistance. The judgment that later generations passed on these choices often failed to account for the impossible situations prisoners faced. Collaboration that appeared contemptible in retrospect might have been the only option for staying alive or protecting loved ones. Resistance that seemed inadequate might have represented extraordinary courage given the circumstances. What remained consistent across different contexts was the fundamental truth that institutional power, no matter how absolute it appeared, always faced limits. Human beings retained some capacity for choice, even in the most constrained circumstances. That capacity might be reduced to purely internal decisions about how to interpret one's situation or what to think about when alone. But it couldn't be eliminated entirely without destroying the person completely. This irreducible core of human agency explained why totalitarian systems ultimately failed despite their sophisticated techniques of control. They could dominate behavior, suppress resistance, terrorize populations, but they couldn't fully colonize human consciousness or eliminate the possibility that people would eventually choose to resist regardless of consequences. The historical record shows that even the most sophisticated systems of control eventually encountered their own contradictions. Prison administrators, who believed they had perfected techniques for breaking human will, discovered that their methods produced unexpected complications. Prisoners who appeared completely broken might suddenly resist in ways that caught authorities off guard. Systems that seemed stable for years could unravel surprisingly quickly when underlying tensions reached critical points. Economic factors created pressures that institutional ideologies couldn't fully accommodate. Prisons required labor to function, but they also needed to maintain control. These dual imperatives sometimes conflicted in ways that created openings for prisoner resistance. Administrators who pushed too hard for productivity might inadvertently create conditions where collective action became possible. Conversely, those who prioritize control above all else might find their institutions becoming economically unsustainable. The contradiction between punishment and rehabilitation that plagued many prison systems created similar tensions. Officials simultaneously claimed to be reforming prisoners while subjecting them to conditions that made any positive change nearly impossible. This hypocrisy was sometimes merely rhetorical, but it could also create genuine confusion within institutions about their actual purposes. Guards who believed rehabilitation rhetoric might implement policies differently than those who saw their role as purely punitive. Generational changes among prison staff introduced additional complications. Guards who had developed their practices during earlier eras might resist reforms introduced by new administrations. Alternatively, younger staff members might question traditional approaches that older personnel considered essential. These internal conflicts could create opportunities for prisoners to exploit divisions among their captors. External pressures from reform movements, international observers, or changing political circumstances forced prison systems to adapt in ways that sometimes weakened their control. Institutions that had operated with complete impunity might face new scrutiny that limited their worst abuses. Even purely symbolic reforms could create precedents that prisoners could later invoke to demand more substantial changes. The documentation practices that prisons used to demonstrate their efficiency and rationality sometimes became weapons against the system itself. Records that administrators created to prove their competence could be used by critics to document abuses. Statistical systems designed to show institutional success might instead reveal patterns of violence or mortality that undermined official narratives. Prisoners who gained access to these documents could use them to expose realities that differed dramatically from public representations. Medical records proved particularly problematic for prison authorities. Doctors who documented injuries or illnesses had to balance institutional loyalty against professional obligations. Their records might later serve as evidence in investigations or legal proceedings that administrators preferred to avoid. Some physicians resolved this dilemma by creating deliberately vague documentation that couldn't be used to prove anything specific. Others maintained detailed records that preserved evidence of abuse, despite administrative pressure to minimize such documentation. The visibility of imprisoned bodies created another source of tension. Prisoners who became too obviously damaged might attract unwanted attention from outside observers. Families who noticed deterioration during visits could complain to authorities or publicize conditions. This visibility sometimes forced administrators to moderate their worst practices, or at least become more careful about which prisoners they subjected to the most severe treatment. Geographic variations in prison conditions reflected broader political and social differences that systems couldn't completely control. Institutions in regions with stronger reform movements or more active oversight faced different constraints than those operating in complete isolation. Prisoners who moved between different facilities sometimes gained perspective on how their treatment compared to what others experienced elsewhere. International comparisons became increasingly important as communication networks improved. Prison reformers could point to different approaches used in other countries to argue for changes at home. Prisoners who learned about conditions elsewhere sometimes organized demands based on these comparisons. Authorities who claimed to operate according to universal principles of justice or humanity found themselves challenged when critics demonstrated that similar institutions elsewhere managed to function without the same level of cruelty. War and other major disruptions created moments when prison systems faced unprecedented challenges. Institutions designed for stable peacetime conditions might struggle to adapt when resources disappeared or when political priorities shifted dramatically. These crisis moments sometimes revealed how fragile institutional control actually was beneath its appearance of permanence and power. Prisoners who survived long enough to witness these disruptions sometimes found opportunities that hadn't existed during normal operations. Guards distracted by external threats might relax their vigilance. Administrative chaos might create gaps in surveillance. Resource shortages might force authorities to release prisoners or reduce populations. Liberation by outside forces remained the ultimate disruption, though prisoners couldn't count on such salvation and had to plan their survival without assuming it would come. The psychological impact of prolonged imprisonment created challenges for both prisoners and institutions. Prisoners who had been incarcerated for years might struggle to maintain their sanity, even when they successfully resisted other forms of institutional pressure. The damage inflicted by isolation, violence, and degradation accumulated over time in ways that couldn't always be reversed even after release. Institutions faced their own psychological pressures. Guards who spent years inflicting suffering on prisoners sometimes experienced moral injury that affected their own mental health. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain beliefs in the justice of what they were doing while witnessing its effects could become unsustainable. Some guards dealt with this tension through increased brutality, convincing themselves that prisoners deserved even worse treatment. Others eventually broke down or sought transfers to less disturbing assignments. Administrative personnel who made decisions from comfortable offices faced different psychological challenges. They could more easily maintain ideological justifications for the system because they didn't directly witness its human costs. But this distance also made them vulnerable to being surprised when their policies produced outcomes they hadn't anticipated. The abstraction that protected them from moral anguish also limited their understanding of what was actually happening in the institutions they managed. The relationship between individual psychology and institutional structures remained complex and bidirectional. Systems shaped how people thought and behaved, but individual choices also influenced how systems evolved. Guards who decided to show mercy in small ways, administrators who quietly undermined the worst policies, doctors who preserved their professional ethics. These individual actions accumulated to create institutions that functioned differently than their designs intended. Prisoners who maintained their humanity despite systematic efforts to destroy it demonstrated that institutional power had limits. Their survival didn't necessarily mean they could change the system or achieve justice. Many prisoners endured terrible suffering and still died in captivity. But their persistence in remaining human despite everything done to them proved that the totalizing ambitions of prison systems could never be fully realized. The question of what survival meant in such contexts defied simple answers. Physical survival was obviously important, but prisoners who stayed alive by completely surrendering their values or betraying others might reasonably question whether what survived was truly themselves. Conversely, prisoners who maintained their principles but died as a result couldn't enjoy their moral victory. The trade-offs between different forms of survival created impossible dilemmas that had no universally correct solutions. Historical analysis of prison systems had to grapple with these ambiguities without falling into either cynical acceptance of power's inevitability or naive celebration of resistance that ignored its costs. The reality was that institutions designed to break people often succeeded, that resistance was frequently crushed, that most prisoners suffered terribly regardless of how they responded to their situations. Acknowledging these grim realities didn't require abandoning recognition that resistance occurred and sometimes mattered. The long-term trajectories of prison systems revealed patterns that individual prisoners couldn't perceive from their limited vantage points. Institutions that seemed invulnerable during particular periods eventually declined or were reformed. Practices that appeared permanently entrenched were sometimes abandoned surprisingly quickly. The arc of history didn't inevitably bend toward justice, but neither was injustice permanent and unchangeable. Prisoners who maintained hope that their suffering might eventually end, or that conditions might improve, were sometimes vindicated. Others died before liberation came. The randomness of who survived and who didn't resist easy moral interpretation. Luck played an enormous role alongside whatever personal qualities individuals possessed. The documentation of these experiences by survivors created knowledge that later generations could use to understand what had happened and hopefully prevent similar abuses. Testimony from those who endured imprisonment provided insights that no outside observer could match. Their accounts revealed the gap between official representations and lived realities, between institutional claims and actual practices. Yet survivor testimony also had limitations. Memory was fallible, especially after traumatic experiences. Survivors might remember some events vividly while forgetting others completely. Their accounts reflected individual perspectives that couldn't capture everything that happened in complex institutional environments. Multiple testimonies might contradict each other without any witness being dishonest, simply because they experienced the same system differently. Historians analyzing prison systems had to triangulate between survivor accounts, official documents, and other evidence to construct understandings that acknowledged both the power of institutions and the agency of those subjected to them. This required avoiding both the trap of treating official records as objective truth and the opposite error of assuming that institutional documentation was pure propaganda with no relationship to reality. The persistence of prison as an institution across different societies and historical periods suggested something about human organization and social control that transcended particular ideologies or political systems. The specific forms that imprisonment took varied enormously, but the basic idea that societies could maintain order by isolating certain people appeared with remarkable consistency. Understanding why this pattern recurred required examining not just the intentions of those who designed prisons, but also the broader social functions these institutions served. Prisons removed people who violated social norms or challenged existing power structures. But they also served symbolic purposes that went beyond simple incapacitation. They demonstrated state power, provided outlets for public desires for vengeance, created visible boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. These functions helped explain why prison systems persisted, even when evidence suggested they failed at their stated goals of reformation or deterrence. The question of whether prison could be reformed or needed to be abolished entirely generated ongoing debates among critics of incarceration. Some argued that the fundamental nature of imprisonment made it irredeemably cruel, regardless of how it was implemented. Others believed that humane imprisonment was possible if institutions were properly designed and operated. These disagreements reflected different assessments of whether the problem stemmed from particular practices or from the basic concept of forcibly confining people. What remained indisputable was that the historical reality of imprisonment had involved enormous suffering inflicted on millions of people across generations. Whatever one concluded about the necessity or justice of incarceration in principle, the actual practice had produced tragedies that demanded acknowledgement and understanding. The human beings who endured these experiences deserved recognition not as abstract victims or statistical data points, but as individuals who lived through specific ordeals with whatever resources they could muster. Their stories revealed the full range of human possibility under extreme pressure. Some prisoners demonstrated extraordinary courage and resilience. Others broke down completely. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, surviving as best they could through combinations of resistance, adaptation, and sheer endurance. All of them faced situations that tested the limits of what human beings could withstand while remaining themselves. The institutional power that shaped their experiences was real and enormous, but it wasn't absolute. That gap between totalitarian aspiration and actual achievement mattered. It created space where human dignity could persist, where resistance remained possible, where hope could survive against overwhelming odds. Understanding that space required taking seriously both the weight of institutional power and the resilience of those who refused to be entirely crushed by it. The fundamental truth embedded in these institutions was that human dignity persisted even when every external force worked to destroy it. Systems built with calculated precision to break spirits discovered repeatedly that consciousness itself remained beyond their complete control. A prisoner stripped of name, possessions, privacy, and freedom still retained the ability to think thoughts that authorities could never fully access or eliminate. This irreducible core of selfhood explains why the most sophisticated techniques of domination ultimately encountered limits. Guards could control bodies, administrators could structure environments, but the interior landscape of human thought remained partially sovereign even in absolute captivity. Prisoners who appeared completely broken sometimes harbored private resistance that their captors never detected. Others who seemed to collaborate maintained secret commitments that sustained them through years of degradation. The documentation of these experiences serves purposes beyond historical record. Understanding how institutions systematically destroyed human beings helps societies recognize similar patterns when they emerge in new forms. The specific techniques change across time and place, but the underlying logic of dehumanization follows recognizable patterns. Stripping identity, eliminating privacy, enforcing arbitrary rules, preventing solidarity, attacking meaning systems. These methods recur because they target fundamental aspects of human psychology. Yet the historical record also demonstrates that resistance persisted despite overwhelming power disparities. Medical staff who preserved professional ethics despite institutional pressure. Guards who showed mercy when they could have inflicted cruelty. Prisoners who maintained humanity when surrender would have been easier. Religious figures who defended dignity when compliance would have been safer. These individual choices accumulated into forces that constrained institutional power, even when they couldn't eliminate it. The question of whether such resistance was worth its costs defies universal answers. Prisoners who died maintaining their principles achieved moral victories that provided no comfort to them or their families. Those who survived through compromises lived with knowledge of what they had sacrificed. The trade-offs between different forms of survival created impossible dilemmas where no choice was clearly correct. What remained consistent was that institutional cruelty required continuous effort to maintain. Systems didn't perpetuate themselves automatically, but depended on countless individual decisions to participate in degradation rather than resist it. Each guard who chose brutality over mercy, each administrator who prioritized control over humanity, each doctor who betrayed professional ethics, these choices sustained institutions that would have collapsed without active collaboration. The visibility of imprisoned suffering created pressures that authorities struggled to manage. Families who witnessed deterioration demanded explanations. Reform movements publicized conditions that differed from official representations. International observers compared practices across different systems and questioned why such variations existed if cruelty was truly necessary. These external pressures didn't automatically produce reforms, but they created costs for maintaining the worst practices. Economic contradictions within prison systems generated additional tensions. Institutions required labor to function, but also needed to maintain control through fear and degradation. These dual imperatives sometimes conflicted in ways that created openings for prisoner agency. Work assignments that allowed minimal communication enabled relationship building that authorities tried to prevent. Economic pressures to increase productivity sometimes forced relaxation of the most extreme isolation practices. The generational transmission of prison practices proved less stable than designers intended. Guards trained in one era's methods faced challenges when new administrators introduced different approaches. Younger staff sometimes questioned traditional practices that veterans considered essential. These internal divisions created opportunities for prisoners to exploit inconsistencies or advocate for changes by pointing to contradictions between stated policies and actual practices. Documentation systems that prisons created to demonstrate efficiency sometimes became weapons against institutional narratives. Records meant to prove competence instead revealed patterns of mortality, violence, or abuse that undermined official claims. Medical files documented injuries that contradicted assertions about humane treatment. Statistical systems exposed disparities that challenged ideological justifications for differential treatment. The psychological toll of inflicting suffering accumulated even among those who benefited from the system. Guards experienced moral injury from witnessing or participating in cruelty. Administrators struggled with cognitive dissonance between their beliefs about justice and the realities their policies produced. These internal contradictions didn't automatically lead to reform, but they created vulnerabilities in systems that appeared impregnable. Survivors who documented their experiences provided testimony that later generations could use to understand what had happened and work to prevent recurrence. Their accounts revealed gaps between official representations and lived realities that no amount of propaganda could fully obscure. Multiple testimonies from different perspectives created composite pictures that approached truth even when individual accounts contained errors or limitations. The persistence of prison as an institution across different societies suggested something about human organization that transcended particular ideologies. The specific forms varied enormously, but the basic concept of maintaining order through selective isolation appeared with remarkable consistency. Understanding this pattern required examining not just designers' intentions, but also broader social functions that incarceration served. These institutions demonstrated state power, provided outlets for desires for vengeance, created visible boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. They removed people who challenged existing arrangements while terrifying others into compliance through visible examples of what resistance would cost. These functions helped explain why prison systems persisted, even when evidence suggested they failed at stated goals of reformation or deterrence. The question of whether humane imprisonment was possible, or whether the concept itself was irredeemably cruel, generated ongoing debates that reflected different assessments of whether problems stemmed from particular practices or from the fundamental nature of forcible confinement. What remained indisputable was that historical reality had involved enormous suffering inflicted on millions across generations. The human beings who endured these experiences deserved recognition, not as abstract victims, but as individuals who lived through specific ordeals with whatever resources they could muster. Their stories revealed the full range of human possibility under extreme pressure. Some demonstrated extraordinary courage. Others broke completely. Most survived through combinations of resistance, adaptation, and endurance that defied simple categorization. The institutional power that shaped their experiences was real and enormous, but never absolute. That gap between totalitarian aspiration and actual achievement created space where dignity could persist, where resistance remained possible, where hope survived against overwhelming odds. Understanding that space required taking seriously both the weight of institutional power and the resilience of those who refused to be entirely crushed. The legacy of these institutions extends beyond their historical moment. The techniques developed for destroying human spirit in Victorian prisons found new applications in 20th century totalitarian systems. The psychological insights gained through systematic cruelty informed later practices of torture and interrogation. The bureaucratic methods for processing human beings as objects rather than persons influenced modern institutional design across multiple contexts. But the legacy also includes knowledge about resistance, survival, and the limits of power. Prisoners who maintained humanity, despite everything, provided evidence that consciousness itself retained sovereignty that external force couldn't fully colonize. Their persistence demonstrated that the totalizing ambitions of domination systems could never be completely realized while their subjects remained alive and aware. This knowledge matters because new forms of systematic dehumanization continue emerging. Technologies change, institutional structures evolve, but the underlying logic of treating people as objects to be controlled and manipulated rather than subjects deserving dignity persists. Recognizing these patterns when they appear in contemporary forms requires understanding how they functioned historically. The Victorian prison system represented one particularly sophisticated attempt to perfect techniques of human control through scientific rationalization of punishment. Its failure to achieve stated objectives of reformation while succeeding spectacularly at producing suffering illustrated fundamental contradictions in attempting to improve people through deliberate degradation. The gap between rehabilitative rhetoric and punitive reality revealed how institutional purposes diverged from public justifications. These contradictions weren't unique to Victorian England, but reflected broader patterns in how societies organize punishment. The specific techniques varied across time and place, but the basic tension between stated goals of reformation and actual practices of degradation recurred with remarkable consistency. Understanding why this pattern persisted required examining not just individual cruelty, but structural arrangements that incentivized harsh treatment regardless of official ideologies. The guards, administrators, doctors, and chaplains who populated these institutions weren't necessarily worse people than those in other professions. Many began with good intentions, believing they were serving justice or helping reform criminals. But institutional structures, peer cultures, and ideological frameworks transformed ordinary people into participants in systematic cruelty through processes that operated largely below conscious awareness. This transformation happened through incremental steps rather than sudden conversions. A guard uncomfortable with violence gradually became desensitized through repeated exposure. An administrator who initially questioned harsh policies, eventually internalized justifications through organizational socialization. A doctor who felt conflicted about minimal care provision eventually normalized it as appropriate for the prisoner population. These gradual adaptations allowed people to participate in terrible practices while maintaining self-images as decent individuals. Understanding these processes matters for preventing future abuses. Focusing only on exceptionally cruel individuals obscures how ordinary people become complicit in systematic cruelty through institutional arrangements that make such complicity seem normal, necessary, or even virtuous. Preventing such transformations requires not just selecting better people, but designing institutions that resist rather than encourage dehumanization. The prisoners themselves demonstrated remarkable diversity in their responses to impossible situations. Some maintained extraordinary courage and dignity. Others collaborated with their oppressors. Most navigated between these extremes, making compromises necessary for survival, while preserving whatever integrity circumstances permitted. Judging these choices from positions of safety and comfort risks profound unfairness to people who face genuinely impossible dilemmas. What survivors' accounts reveal is that human psychology under extreme stress operates according to patterns that differ significantly from normal circumstances. Behaviors that appear cowardly or contemptible in ordinary contexts might represent rational adaptations to situations where different choices meant death. Conversely, actions that seem heroic might have resulted from psychological processes rather than conscious moral decisions. The complexity of human responses to extreme situations resists simple moral categorization. People were neither purely victims with no agency nor free actors making unconstrained choices. They existed in the complicated space between these extremes, exercising whatever limited agency their circumstances permitted, while being profoundly shaped by forces beyond their control. This recognition doesn't eliminate moral distinctions or suggest that all responses were equally valid. Some choices were genuinely more courageous, more ethical, more worthy of admiration than others. But making such judgments requires deep understanding of specific contexts rather than applying abstract principles developed for normal circumstances to situations that were anything but normal. The historical distance that separates contemporary readers from Victorian prisons creates both advantages and challenges for understanding. Distance provides perspective that enables recognition of patterns that participants couldn't see. It allows analysis unclouded by immediate emotional responses that might distort judgment. But distance also risks making experiences seem less real, reducing actual human suffering to abstract intellectual problems rather than lived realities that destroyed countless lives. Maintaining appropriate balance requires constant effort to remember that historical accounts describe real people who experienced genuine suffering rather than characters in morality tales designed to teach lessons. The prisoners who died in these institutions, the guards who became brutalized by their work, the families torn apart by imprisonment, all were human beings whose experiences mattered, regardless of what lessons later generations might extract from studying them. The documentation of prison experiences serves multiple purposes that sometimes create tensions. Preserving memory honors those who suffered while providing evidence that can prevent future abuses. But transforming lived experience into historical narrative inevitably involves simplifications that can't fully capture the complexity of what actually happened. Written accounts, however detailed, remain representations that differ from the experiences they describe. Survivors who testified about their imprisonment often struggled with this gap between experience and representation. Words seemed inadequate to convey the full reality of what they endured. Audiences who hadn't experienced similar situations often couldn't fully comprehend descriptions of conditions that seemed beyond human endurance. This communication difficulty didn't mean testimony was worthless, but it required recognizing that historical understanding remained necessarily incomplete. The incomplete nature of historical knowledge about imprisonment doesn't justify abandoning attempts to understand what happened. Even partial, imperfect understanding serves important purposes. It provides evidence that can challenge official narratives that minimized or denied abuses. It preserves memory of suffering that might otherwise be forgotten. It offers insights that can inform contemporary debates about punishment, justice, and human rights. Most importantly, studying historical prisons keeps faith with those who endured them by refusing to let their experiences disappear into historical oblivion. Many prisoners died believing their suffering was meaningless and would be forgotten immediately. Documentation and study of their experiences proves that judgment wrong. Their suffering mattered enough that people decades or centuries later continue working to understand what happened and ensure such abuses don't recur. This commitment to memory and understanding doesn't require believing that studying history automatically prevents repetition. Historical knowledge provides resources for recognizing and resisting new forms of systematic cruelty, but it doesn't guarantee that such cruelty won't occur. Human societies continue developing new techniques for dehumanization despite extensive historical documentation of previous abuses. What historical knowledge can provide is recognition of warning signs when institutions begin moving towards systematic cruelty. The patterns are recognizable. Dehumanizing language that makes abuse seem acceptable. Administrative structures that diffuse responsibility. Ideological frameworks that define certain people as deserving harsh treatment. Elimination of oversight mechanisms that might constrain abuse. When these patterns appear, historical knowledge enables naming what's happening and mobilizing opposition before practices become fully entrenched. The Victorian prison system eventually declined, not because authorities suddenly developed consciences, but because reform movements, changing social attitudes, and practical difficulties made continued operation in traditional forms unsustainable. The specific reforms that emerged often disappointed advocates who hoped for more fundamental changes, but incremental improvements that reduced the worst abuses while preserving imprisonment as an institution represented victories for prisoners whose suffering was somewhat diminished even when their fundamental situation remained unjust. This pattern of gradual reform, producing partial improvements that fell short of transformative change, characterized many institutional transitions. Complete abolition of abusive systems rarely occurred. More commonly, the worst practices were modified while core structures persisted in altered forms. This created situations where critics could legitimately argue both that conditions had improved and that fundamental problems remained unresolved. The question of whether partial reforms that preserved problematic institutions were better than nothing, or whether they simply made injustice more sustainable, admitted no universal answer. For prisoners whose suffering was reduced by reforms, improvements clearly mattered, regardless of theoretical concerns about systemic change. For critics worried about long-term justice, reforms that stabilized unjust systems by eliminating their most obviously indefensible features represented obstacles to more fundamental transformation. These tensions between incremental improvement and systemic change remain relevant for contemporary debates about prison reform. The same arguments Victorian reformers made about gradually improving conditions versus abolishing imprisonment entirely continue appearing in current discussions. Historical perspective suggests that both approaches have played roles in reducing suffering, though neither has produced perfect justice. What remains clear from examining Victorian prisons is that the suffering inflicted on hundreds of thousands of prisoners over decades resulted from deliberate choices made by people who designed, administered, and staffed these institutions. The cruelty wasn't accidental or inevitable, but reflected specific decisions about how to organize punishment. Different choices would have produced different outcomes, though such alternatives faced political, economic, and ideological obstacles that made them difficult to implement. The prisoners who endured these experiences demonstrated that human dignity could persist even under conditions designed to destroy it completely. Their survival, resistance, and occasional triumph over impossible circumstances proved that consciousness itself retained sovereignty that external power couldn't fully colonize. This evidence matters for understanding human possibility and limitation under extreme conditions. The guards, administrators, and other personnel who participated in systematic cruelty illustrated how ordinary people could be transformed into perpetrators of abuse through institutional structures and cultures that normalized violence. This evidence matters for understanding how to prevent such transformations in future contexts. The reformers who worked to improve conditions while often accepting imprisonment's basic legitimacy demonstrated how incremental change occurred through political processes that required compromise and patience. This evidence matters for understanding how institutional transformation actually happens rather than how it might ideally occur. The families who struggled to maintain connections with imprisoned loved ones across barriers of distance, silence, and institutional hostility demonstrated how punishment extended beyond intended targets to affect entire communities. This evidence matters for understanding the full social costs of incarceration. All of these different perspectives and experiences contributed to the complex reality of Victorian imprisonment. No single narrative could capture everything that happened across decades and multiple institutions. But examining the system from multiple angles provides understanding that honors the complexity of what actually occurred rather than reducing it to simplified morality tales. The ultimate lesson from Victorian prisons wasn't that people were either purely good or purely evil, that institutions were either wholly rational or completely irrational, that reform was either impossible or inevitable. The lesson was that human beings operating within institutional structures made choices that produced enormous suffering, that some people resisted and others collaborated with such cruelty, that change occurred through messy political processes rather than clean moral awakenings. This understanding resists simple conclusions, but provides resources for thinking carefully about contemporary issues. When societies debate how to respond to crime, what treatment prisoners deserve, whether rehabilitation is possible or desirable, historical knowledge about how previous generations addressed these questions offers evidence about what approaches produced what outcomes. This evidence doesn't determine correct answers, but it enriches debates by showing what actually happened when different philosophies were implemented. The prisoners who suffered in Victorian institutions left behind testimony, memories, and evidence that their experiences mattered and demanded recognition. Honoring that demand requires neither celebrating their suffering as noble, nor dismissing it as inevitable. It requires clear-eyed acknowledgement of what happened, why it happened, and what contemporary societies might learn from examining these historical experiences. That acknowledgement begins with recognizing that the people in these institutions were fully human, despite systematic efforts to reduce them to something less. They thought, felt, hoped, despaired, resisted, surrendered, survived, and died as human beings, facing impossible situations with whatever resources they possessed. Their humanity persisted regardless of whether authorities acknowledged it, and that persistence itself represented victory over systems designed to eliminate it.